that being said, I'll call the meeting to order, and we'll start with the pledge. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, well, good crowd tonight. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to the budget presentation. Just as a quick reminder to reiterate what we said at the end of the last meeting was this is just a budget presentation. There's no president comments, not including what I'm doing right now. There's no board member comments. There's no public comments. This is just a presentation, and then we'll wrap it up. So that being said, we will turn it right over to Renee.
So my team and I are prepared to kind of walk you through where we're at with the budget process, and we're going to begin with the end in mind. The outcomes of our budget are really to talk about the timeline so you know what to expect next in the actual budget process. Then you're going to see some budget facts. In front of you are a few documents. The first one that you will notice is the line by line. This is updated since the last time that we looked at the line by line with a few adjustments, and Mr. Adsef, our Assistant Superintendent for Business, will go through that a little bit. Not line by line, but actual big picture for you. Then you'll look at some budget facts as far as our revenue reports and reserve amounts and things like that, and then some state aid facts, kind of what to expect next. I know there's a lot of predicting of what the governor's budget might become once it's adopted. We'll kind of walk you through some possible scenarios and some thinking behind that before we actually adopt. And then Joe's going to close it with our next steps, and then we'll follow the rest of the agenda from there. So I'll actually ask Mr. Adsef to step forward. Again, he's our Assistant Superintendent for Business, and he has Tom here tonight, and you'll introduce Tom.
Yes, Tom Zuber is a shareholder from Ray Wager, CPA Incorporated. They're the district's external auditors. Tom is going to help me on certain, join me for part of the presentation when we talk about appropriated fund balance. He's got some examples to share. You know, what is appropriated fund balance, why do districts have it, what's the concept, and some of those things. So looking at the agenda, the next thing we want to discuss is the timeline. And as you know, the budget calendar that the board adopted has us slated to adopt a budget to put forth to the voters on April 10th, which will be our next board meeting. So that's part of the reason why today's meeting is dedicated to going over the budget. It's a workshop for the board to gather information, ask questions. And once we adopt on April 10th, there's a lot of work that we do after that. We have to do the budget newsletter. We have to get our budget book list ready, our public notices, all that stuff. So the timeline is built in from the budget vote date, which is actually May 20th in the foyer of the new gymnasium, and we work backwards from that time frame so that we can get everything done. So are there any questions on the timeline? So we've got tonight's meeting, and then at the next meeting we would be asking the board to adopt the budget that they would put forward for the 2014-15 school year to the voters of Wayne Central. Okay, so as the superintendent shared with you, there's a packet in front of you, and we'll start with the big line by line. I'm not going to go through the entire document, but there are some changes since the last board meeting, so I thought it was relevant to share an updated version with you. At the last board meeting, there was some things included on the personnel action that changed the budget going forward for next year. So whatever those items were that had an impact on next year's budget were factored into the draft you see in front of you. We also I made an adjustment to both the ERS code and the Social Security code, reducing each one of those by $90,000, just kind of tightening down our numbers as we continue to go through the process. Those are pretty much the major changes, and I'm going to go actually right to the end of the document. Get it up on the screen here so everybody can see it. Okay, so looking at the screen, so with all the updated numbers, as we said before, the first column represents what our current budget is, $42,797,485. This is our adjusted budget. So the difference between these two numbers are any carryover encumbrances. Carryover encumbrances would have been anything that was ordered last school year and committed to that hadn't been actually received prior to June 30th. But being on the modified accrual basis of accounting, you have to set that money aside and recognize the revenue and expense when it's earned, not necessarily when it's received. The next column shows you what's been spent to date. This column represents encumbrances. School districts do mass encumbering, so any of our known expenses, we encumber the money at the beginning of the year, like our entire apparel gets encumbered, our hospitalization, our debt service, ERS, TRS, Social Security, all those codes get encumbered so that we can track where we are throughout the year. And this last column represents what's being proposed for next school year, $44,488,715. That represents a 3.95% increase in spending. And we've gone over, when we did the presentation, the components of what those increases are. There's additional staff that's included in that number. We had shared that with you earlier. There's cost increases for health insurance. Health insurance is slated to go up 11.5%. The TRS is going up to 17.53% of certified teacher salaries. ERS actually is going down from, I think it's 20.5 to 20.1% of civil service staff or classified staff salaries. Workers' comp is going up quite a bit. So this represents the total.
Can you say that total again, Mr. Edsel?
$44,488,715.
$44,488,000.
That's not the figure we
Right.
have.
Yeah, well, just tell me what the date of your report is that you have there on the screen.
310.
Okay.
Same here.
Same here.
This is
So-
44,681,495.
Right.
So it's just a slight adjustment from where you're at.
At the 180.
The
No, we're on the right
44,488 is on this one, Greg, but not the one
Not
on
the
this.
line by line.
Oh, yeah, you're right. So what should it be? 44 what?
That should be that number right there.
Well, I can't see it. So what is he saying?
What time was your report run?
44,488,715.
Yeah, that's not the same. So there's a figure up in that thing that's,
It was run at
there's figures that aren't right
11:07.
somewhere in that column.
So it was, his
Yeah,
was
it's
run
right.
at 11:07.
So it went down.
What does yours say what ours says, Greg?
Yeah, unless I might have grabbed the wrong one to copy it.
Oh,
Hang on a second. No, mine does not say what yours says, I'm sorry.
wait a minute.
No, I have a copy of yours. I think I might have grabbed the wrong one to copy.
Yeah.
This is timestamp 4:38 PM, does that
Yeah,
help?
it should be dated 3/19.
So we'll make
For
copies
some
of
reason I
that.
grabbed the wrong one. I
Can you
apologize
just
for
pass
that.
your copies to Debbie Hibbard?
Sorry. Sorry about that. It should be dated March 19th.
No, just the
Not
line by
March.
line.
So these are.
I apologize for
Just
that.
the line by line passing to Debbie.
This figure here is correct.
Just line by line.
Just this one here and this one here.
No, there's no line by line. This is line by line.
Did I get too much? Okay, got it.
Are you taking this way or are you going that way?
Sorry, I'm just trying to.
So, I apologize for that, that's my fault, I must have grabbed the wrong one to copy. This is the correct number right here, 44,488,715. And we'll get you these running copies right now. So just moving on, so when we look at the total, the administrative component represents 9.85% of our total. The capital component, which is debt service, operations and maintenance, anything to do with maintaining the buildings, represents 10.435%. And program, which is obviously our core mission, instruction, our students with special needs, transportation, library, nursing, counseling, OCAD, any of those things all fall under the program. That represents the lion's share, or 79.71% of our total. It's always been our philosophy, you've heard me say this over and over again, we want to allocate at least 70% of our resources towards our core mission. We're actually at 79, almost 80%. So we're pleased with that. We never like to see the administrative piece go over 10%. Those are just targets that we use. The capital tends to fluctuate depending on where your debt service is. If you have new debt service going online, that number will go up. We've actually paid off some debt service. Ours has been declining, so that percentage has kind of gone down a little bit. But the program is the one that we really try to target to make sure that it's as high as possible, because that means that the majority of our resources are going towards students and instruction, which is our main goal. So like I said, this is the updated version. It included adjustments to ERS, $90,000 reduction in that code, a $90,000 reduction to Social Security, and some staffing, some salary code adjustments based on last meeting's personnel action that had some personnel action items that affected next year's staffing.
So, Greg, I don't have, obviously, the numbers in front of me right now, but what I was starting to try and calculate was, and tell me if I'm off with the new numbers, we've gone up roughly $2 million year over year?
Yes, a little under $2 million.
Okay.
Oh,
And of that, about how much is associated with salaries and benefits?
Our total budget, about 75% of our total budget is allocated towards salary and benefits.
Right, but of that 2 million, roughly $1.8 million increase, how much of that is teacher salaries and benefits?
Typically for a district our size, our salary increases for both of our bargaining units will average between $750,000 and $1 million. And then the rest of the increases are going to come in the benefits area for the retirement systems, workers' comp, and health insurance.
Yeah, because that's what I started to add up, and I think it's slightly over, at least $1 million of that 1 point something is salaries and benefits. I mean, just because I was trying to look at where's it all coming from. And then I didn't get a chance to figure out the rest of it, but I just, you know, because people look at it and they say, well, $2 million year over year, that's a lot of money, but
Right.
a lot of it we're contractually bound by for benefits and salaries.
Right, those salary increases are based on the contractual agreements we have, and we will be negotiating with CSCA. So we don't have an agreement for next year, but
Right.
we
So
have
I'm
some money built in there. We
Trying to get
projected
to what part of that was actually something we could decide on, because we can't decide on things that we're contractually bound to do.
Correct, that's correct. Yeah, as a, you know, when you look at our budget, Karen, I mean, we're a labor-intensive organization, so the majority of our resources tend to be human, you know, teachers and staff members.
The other question I had, and I just wanted to make sure, Mr. Myler had sent in a couple of questions, and I just wanted to make sure somebody got back to him with answers on those either through the audit committee or some other way.
I answered his first set of questions,
Okay.
and he did follow those up yesterday with some other questions, some follow-up questions. And I believe some of those questions will be answered tonight in the presentation. I didn't get a chance to actually email him back specifically on the second round of questions, but some of those will be answered tonight.
Well, you're ahead of me. I haven't seen the second round yet, so glad we got back on the first round.
So now if you flip to the last page of this, you should see 44, 488, 715. So I apologize for that, but
Now, as you go over this, do you want us to save our questions or ask
no,
you
you
guys?
can, if you have questions on the expenditure part, you can jump in at any time. I didn't have to go line by line because we've already done that. I'd be happy to answer any questions about anything that's in this part of the budget if you have it. Our administrative team is also here in case there's something I don't have the answer to.
Where would the changes in the salaries be reflected as to where you just made different decisions from what we were shown before?
So in the high school 2110,
We're getting a librarian, right?
no, yeah, but that was already factored in.
Okay.
But if you think of the last personnel action, I think there was the board accepted a resignation.
Right.
So that would be factored into, on page 4.
But we have a replacement, I'm sure, right? But the replacement would be less money, is that?
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct, 2110, 13001. So in this code here, Carla, this number would have been adjusted right there.
Okay.
So if you look at that number,
All right.
compared to the last printout,
Okay.
I believe in the last personal action, I don't have it in front of me, but we added a one-to-one aid for is it a new student, Michelle, or just the needs have changed?
New student.
New student. So that had not been factored in previously, so that was added to the 2250.
Okay. I mean, that's something that can change all the time. If
Right.
new move-ins or whatever. Do we
Right.
budget that? Do we cushion that? So if there is,
Mhm.
you know, a couple new kids, or somebody gets classified, or it's
Well,
not
that's-
working where it is?
Right, and that's when we get into the appropriated fund balance part of the presentation. That's exactly why we do that, because, as I've tried to explain before, if a family moves in, say you guys adopt a budget on April 10th, and on June 1st, we have a new family come to Wayne Central, say they have 4 children, say they all have an IEP. We would not have been able to budget for those needs because those children didn't exist at the time we put our budget together.
Right.
But the law says, we can't say, sorry, you have to wait a year until the budget cycle comes around. You have to address those needs. That's why we have some flexibility built into our budget to be able to address needs like that. Another example, last week we had a problem with our network. And Barb, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of our main servers had a problem. To fix it would have cost $117,000 part.
It was actually a core switch.
Core switch.
Which just connects us to our network, and that went down.
Right, so we do have our servers on a replacement plan, but that was one that wasn't scheduled to be replaced, I don't think.
It was a core switch that's on a warranty,
Right.
and the warranty actually covered it, but if it was out of warranty, that could have been an issue.
Right. So there's certain things that we can say yes and no to, like, we can say we're not going to be able to buy new uniforms for a sports team, or maybe go on a field trip, but, you know, IEP things, certain things that are mandated by law, you know, we have to meet those mandates. So we do have some flexibility built in.
Well, if I have a question about staffing, can I ask that now?
Sure.
Because I took last Friday off, and I
Okay.
visited all the buildings and had a great time. And I went to the middle school, and I've known for a long time that the middle school has the different teams, they're all named after planets.
Mhm.
But I think this happened maybe when my kids were there or whatever, it's not quite even with the amount of teachers on one 7th grade team and the amount of teachers on the other 7th grade team. And then Pam shared with me this graph of the kids that are coming from 6th grade going into 7th grade next year. It's a bigger class, and there seems to be like a lot more, I don't want to say needier children, but children who aren't meeting really the benchmark to where they should be. And I just didn't know I know she said they were hiring a TA, but I didn't know why we haven't evened out those teams yet, especially when we have a class that's coming up that's going to need more support. And we have, I think, don't we have teachers teaching like at least one period outside their certification? But we have part-time or something to that effect. It's not quite even, is it, between Jupiter and Saturn?
I have a dual certified teacher who teaches both special ed and social studies.
So we do what we can with the staff that we have, and when staff are dual certified, they do try to even the teams out by using them on more than one team. So we do our best with what we have. If we notice that the need is there, then the first step in the process is actually to present that need to the administrative council with the data to support it, and that's what you're holding is the actual data that Pam Tatros presented to the administrative council. And then as we share in the understanding of what that need is, we'll support it.
So we're getting a teaching assistant, but not a teacher.
Because we have a unique situation in the middle school where there's a literacy specialist for every grade level. So with a literacy specialist at 6th grade to support those needs, 7th grade and 8th grades, we feel like we're in good shape.
And if it isn't, if we find that there's more, we can do something about it.
That's
Because
exactly-
I just went home and looked at this, and I just said, wait a minute, this is the grade level in the middle school that isn't quite, I don't know what you want to use, but balanced or even. And I know we're supposed to stay at that 50,000, but it just, when I got this, when she shared this and went over it with me, I was like, well, wait a minute, this is the class that needs the most support, and then they're going to a group that's maybe not.
I don't want that chart to scare you either. It's speaking to level 1s, 2s, and
Right.
3s and 4s.
There's a lot of twos here.
Typically, when you have a 1 and a 2, it means they need additional academic intervention support.
Right.
And I'm actually going to turn it over to Mr. Syracuse from this point forward because the cut scores have changed, and that chart is a little bit, could use a little more explanation. So.
Okay.
Sure. First of all, the chart, no, I know it, but first of all, the chart is alarming. We're not unlike other districts. The New York State promised last year that all test scores would drop by 25%, and they were true to their word. Across the state, all scores, we saw our scores in our district and across districts drop by about that rate. I presented to the board late this summer how we did as a district in those measures, and it was important that I also included some relative data because the standards changed, the assessments changed. How do we do again? I don't want to say against, because this is not, school is not a competition, but in comparison to other districts, and we compared relatively well. New York State saw that the academic intervention system requiring all schools to provide intervention for all students who scored a 1 or 2 on those math and ELA measures would break systems across the state. Because we had passing rates at some places. Yes, our 6th grade is needy. We had passing, and I can't quote those passing rates across the board, but they were relatively more needy than some of our other grade levels. But New York State recognized that if we require direct intervention for all 2s, it would break systems. So the cut score is within the 2. We want to give all of our kids the academic support they need. But we know that typically our rule of thumb and rules of thumb across the board were, at 10%, that's intervention, and that's direct classroom instruction. If 10% of your kids are struggling, it's about the classroom instruction. And it's about intervention, I'm sorry. Above 10%, that's intervention. So pulling kids, providing extra support and those things. With the state assessments being at 35 and 40%, we have the reading specialist. Pam has asked for the TA to provide some supplemental support, but it wouldn't be true to say that according to New York State, we're not meeting New York State's mandate.
I just want, and then in the 7th grade are the amount of kids that will be split into this team going to be even? If there's 200 kids, 100 on Saturn, 100 on Jupiter?
Well, typically, yes, but those schedules aren't, we don't have the schedules.
But that's what you're anticipating.
Can I get a process check here, Phil? Because this is not, as a board, we can't be deciding who's going in what group and plan it. We got to get through a lot of important stuff.
I know that, Debbie, but I want, and I don't want to scare the administrators from sharing this. It's just that I had questions as to why this is the way it is.
It's good to have questions. I'm just not sure this is the place for those specific questions, that's all.
Well,
And just to be clear, we had some things that we presented that we shared with you that we added within the year this year. Last year, we had a situation at Freewell where we were watching those numbers very closely. We had to add a section in August to Freewell because the sections were off.
right.
And we weren't within it, and we did that. We were able to do that. We had a situation with some of our special ed needs where we saw an increase in needs and we needed to add a special ed staff, and we did that within the year. So we do have it within the budget, enough flexibility, the way the budget's structured now, that if we saw that as our next and most glaring need, that we could respond to that.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know. And thanks, Pam, for sharing this. And I don't want you guys to not share stuff, but I went home and I'm like, wait a minute, it just didn't all add up in my head, and that's why I want clarification. Just want to make sure that we're...
Ron, you have a question?
Yeah, of the 1.6 million difference between 13-14 and next year's proposed budget, most of the staffing is almost entirely due to students not doing as well based upon the Common Core and/or kids with special needs, correct? With the exception of the part-time librarian at the high school, I'm sorry,
even the
media
part-
specialist.
Even the media specialist at the high school really is in response to a couple of things. More reliance at the high school on the library in support of staff, and more students accessing the library in response to a heavier requirement and emphasis in the standards on developing research skills in our kids. So I would argue that perhaps that .4 is also connected to the shift in standards.
Okay.
Yeah,
But the point I'm trying to make is the vast majority of staff is due to students not doing as well on the Common Core assessment as they had done the previous year.
Right.
Okay.
Addressing academic needs,
Yeah.
not enrollment increase, that's
Right,
correct.
okay.
That's absolutely
Okay.
Yeah,
correct.
that's a good clarification. All right, thanks, Greg.
So this number represents what we call a rollover budget. Basically, this budget includes everything that we are doing currently, rolls it forward for next year with next year's cost applied to it. Okay?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Because my year I do the nickels and dimes stuff. I looked at our legal fees.
Mhm.
This is the question I asked. So this first line, it's on the second page. The first line says 30, that was last year's budget, correct?
That's the current budget for 13-14. That was the original budget, that's correct.
So the 150 for 13-14 adjusted, what is that?
That means that I've added 120,000 to make the budget from 30 to 150 based on how much money we're spending on legal fees. And, we were about 6 months through the process, and taking that monthly average, I extrapolated it out through the end of June, and
You
came up
actually came
with...
to the board with a budget transfer to make that happen.
Right, because it was in excess of 10,000. So
Correct.
we've estimated, Jeremy, how much it'll be legal fees for the whole year, and so we had to increase the budget from 130 to 150.
Okay, so the 88 is what we've spent so far this year.
That's correct.
The 61 is what we think what's that encumbered at?
That's the balance of the code encumbered, because we believe we're going to probably spend all of that.
And now we budget next year for 105.
Correct.
Now, when I went through our invoices, 3 incidents happened this year that I would pray never happen again. And when I did the math, it was almost $50,000 to cover those 3. Do we take into account that in a perfect world, that won't happen again next year? Do we have to, and again, I know we're talking millions and I'm talking thousands.
No, it's a good
To
question.
take that 50,000 and put it there, I don't expect incident A, incident B,
Right.
or,
Right. So I think it's a great question. I think part of the increase is due to some unique situations. I think part of it also, Jeremy, represents, in the past we had Wayne Vanderbilt. Wayne was a sole proprietor, so when you called him, it was just Wayne. The firm that we are using now, much bigger law firm, their process is they assign a lead attorney, so we start with that attorney, and if it doesn't fall under his area of expertise, he brings in other attorneys in his office. So just because of that change in structure, our costs are going to go up. We try to budget maximum exposure. I would agree, I would hope that in a year we don't keep getting those types of situations on a routine basis. That's why we've got it at 105, not 150. But that's, it's an estimate. And that's why I say that the budget is a very fluid document. The only time these numbers are going to be the way they are is on July 1st.
because we've already seen the difference between.
Right, after that, we can have one of those situations occur, we got to adjust our resources. We might have an influx of enrollment over the summer, we might have to, one of the principals might say, I need another section. So then we'll start doing budget transfers, which show up in this second column there.
All right.
But we do budget for what we call maximum exposure. We try to balance that with not being excessive to the community, because we do take the community's ability to pay for what we're asking them to into strong consideration.
Because I guess that was my thing. If we end up at the end of the year spending 100, and next year we have budgeted 105, knowing that half of that 100 went to those incidents, is that something that we'll back out so we don't get in danger of, again, I know I'm the pennies guy to the millions, but somebody's saying, why did you budget this much money when we probably weren't gonna
Right.
need it?
It's very similar to when we looked at the board budget codes before we looked at the administrative component. We try to give you the 3 years worth of trend data to
Right.
say, this is what your typical spending has been. Then you can make a more informed decision. You're right, when you have 3 incidents, which are about 50,000 in legal fees, you know that that most likely will not occur again. Once you get through another budget cycle and you see that that number could be smaller, then you can look at more of a
Right.
tightening up there.
All right, and it was,
So, and Jeremy, once we get a couple years of experience under our belt with this different firm and the different structure, I think we'll have a better idea because we'll have a better track record of how our expenditures are running. You know, right now, it's an apples and oranges comparison as well as the unique situations.
all right.
Can I just follow that up with one comment that I think that related to those incident A, incident B, tens of thousands of dollars were spent legally based on board choices. The board owns part of that increase. And I think
Right.
publicly, the criticism that's gone to administrators causing these legal fees, I don't think is entirely fair, because we all know sitting here that we supported certain things and it was justified, we needed to do it. But that was us, and I just kind of wanted to put that out for the record, that a lot of those charges were because of the board, not because of anyone else.
But it's hard to say that if next year something happened, would the board make the same decision?
Right.
Would they decide to spend legal fees in that amount again? I can't really tell you that would be a yes or a no. So do you budget for it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and to compound with what Deb just said is, on top of that, you do have a new board, or a young board, I should say.
Speak for yourself.
Inexperienced. So, again, you know, that might be another factor that kind of adds to that number. You have new officers that may lean on legal advice more than a veteran would. So that also. I want to jump in real quick on 2 things both Deb said, and one is, I think it is incumbent upon the board to, I'd like to second what Deb said, and that is, there's been a lot of discussion about the amount of legal fees, and it's really easy to target our administrators in our district and say, you. It's great for the board. I like to be out of the line of fire. But in reality, what Deb just said, it should be reiterated and owned by the board, that there was a lot of money, a lot of legal fees this year that the board owns. And that was the board making the decision to further to press a little further. And it really, I don't want it to just be Deb saying it, and it's just Deb saying it. I'd like it to come from the president of the board as well, that says, we own some of those fees. It's not all the district administrators. And for us to willfully step out of the way as the bullets are flying is not right. So I'll second that to Deb. And then the last thing is, Deb had done a process check here. And I got to tell the administrators and the veteran board members, this is my first time doing this. My head is spinning already when I even started. And so when questions get asked, if you know, I'm still learning when we should ask it, what we should ask, what is right, what is wrong. And so you're just going to have to kind of bear with me. I appreciate Deb stepping up and saying, you know, that maybe that's not quite where we want to go. However, on the other hand, if we have questions that we want asked, I also think we should ask them. So it's a balancing act, and I would also tell the administrators, you have a young board here, an experienced board. If we're going into the weeds on something, tell us.
So if I could just talk process for 1 second, Carla, getting back to your question. So the staffing that you have at the middle school is a recommendation of our middle school principal.
Right.
She brought it to us. And that doesn't preclude her from, once we start next school year, if that plan that she's got in place doesn't work and the kids' needs aren't being met, at any time she can come to administrative council and recommend that she needs more staffing.
Okay.
We added a bunch of positions this year. Some you just approved, I think, at the last board meeting. Mr. LaRouche identified some needs in his building, and we stepped up and added that. So they're the experts in the building, they come to us. Sometimes we're in a position where we have to say, you got too much staff, what can you reduce? We haven't asked them to reduce anything because we think we have a budget plan moving forward that meets all these needs and actually balances for the taxpayers as well. But there's a structure in place, and it's based on her recommendation or any of the recommendations, but that, if it's not working, there's plenty of flexibility to adjust.
I guess that's really what I want to make sure that our staff, our teachers, the people that are servicing our kids get what they need, even if it's 20 weeks into the year or
Yes.
something like that.
Yep. And our administrators are very good about representing the needs of the kids. They're not bashful.
Any other questions on the line by line? All right, Greg, move us to the next
Oh,
document.
I've got one comment.
Sure.
As we discussed earlier, I'd really like to see in there our intentions on reserve funds. And I don't know how the rest of the board feels, but I think that this is the time to bring that up.
It's the next sheet. You're saying put it on line by line, or
Yes,
the next sheet isn't enough?
no, on line by line, because that's what was recommended in the state audit report.
Reserves on line by line.
Yep, call them out. Your intentions to fund.
So you'll see the intentions on the next sheet and the revenue report.
Right, but it should be in the budget. Should be in the budget that the voters approve.
Okay.
So if I understand Matt's question, what the discussion at the audit committee meeting that came up with was if there's money in the budget that's going to be used to fund reserves, why isn't it clearly spelled out in the budget document? And that was, he's right, that was a question or a comment from the comptroller's report. I'm not aware, and I'll point to Tom and have him step in with this. I'm not aware of any school district that does it that way. I think one of the dangers of that, I think on one hand, for transparency and everything, that's great. But I think on another hand, the danger that you have with that is that if your budget's tight, or if, actually if your budget's tight, and people will automatically go to that line and say, get rid of that.
Tom, do you typically see the reserve activity outlined on a line by line?
No, that's not typically the way that the majority of the school districts budget for funding of reserves. Typically, most school districts, if they, at the end of the year, identify funds that are available to fund a reserve, that's typically when it's done.
Well, that's what we've been doing.
Right.
So it's been out in public, it's not like,
Right, but
we've
what
made-
Matt is saying is when you develop the budget document, like right here, you would have a code. Oops.
It's a tough screen.
Just touch it again, it'll go white. There you go.
What Matt's concept is you would have a code here that would say transfer to reserve funds and call out a dollar amount.
So of the, I'm sorry, I'm not afraid to ask. Of the 44 million-ish, if we are intending to fund a reserve, and we intend on putting $1 million in that reserve, you're saying on the budget that we're voting on, literally put it in there that says we're putting $1 million into that reserve.
I'm not sure I would say $1 million, but yes, that's a concept.
2 trillion. So, and then so let me follow this along now. One of the things that would jump right out at me is, as this budget is a living, breathing document, and we get a family of 4 students that come in here, and it shoots part of our budget apart, and then 2 servers die, and it shoots our budget apart, and next thing you know, we're tight goes from tight to uh-oh. Well, I don't want to put $1 million in that reserve. I only want to put 700,000 in it.
Right.
So if I call it out at the start of the,
No, you can do the same thing. It's a fluid document. You can still take it from there, right? You can still divert
Yes,
from there
yes.
if you need to.
okay.
The board could still divert funds from that code to other areas of the budget.
So we
based
vote
on
on the budget that says we're putting $1 million into Reserve A. At the end of the year, we only have 700,000 to put in it. Can we just adjust it? Okay, all right.
Let me just step in on that. The audit recommendation was district officials should include both the funding and use of all reserves in their adopted budget plan each year to provide transparencies for the district voters. And our implementation plan of action on our draft corrective action plan was district will continue to include reserve balance and usage information in its budget plan. This has occurred during the 2011-12 budget plan, 2012-13 budget plan, 13-14. Will also include any proposed funding or reserves in its budget plan on an annual basis to provide a transparent process for district voters. That's what we put in that we were going to do. So that's what we should do, and how we do it is what we decide to do it. Whether it's the same as it was, make it more pronounced that people see that.
There is no money included in this budget that right now is dedicated to fund reserves.
So you have an external auditor who's saying it doesn't need to be on the line by line. You have your fund balances, which are outlined in a separate document, and your revenue sheet. That's actually the use, not the funding of. What's the pleasure of the board?
Am I missing a document? Because I don't see the fund balance document.
Did you turn yours in with the first papers?
It's this one here.
Oh, I probably turned it in with the first papers. Thank you.
It'll be on the screen next if we're ready to move to that.
If nobody else does it, why not, what is the?
Well, and I guess I'll just make one comment. When the district did do that, when we were planning on the last capital project, in our budget newsletter, it was clearly earmarked that we were doing that. We said we had this much in reserves, we need this much more in reserves, and our budget plan includes getting us to that number. So, was it in this line-by-line document? No. But it was in the budget newsletter that's mailed to every resident of Wayne Central. So, you know, there's different ways to accomplish it, but that's why I don't want to say challenge what the comptroller said, but I showed them that newsletter. It was clearly earmarked in there that we were doing that. It was talked about in open session. It was a direction from the board and the superintendent to the administration. You know, the fact that people said it was done underhandedly, I will continue to always disagree with that. The issue was nobody was paying attention then. We weren't under scrutiny for all the issues that we've talked about as A, B, and C. So it was done in open session, it was shared in a document. You know,
I'm just going by, the
Right.
recommended
But I
done
can
that
tell you
way,
that
and it's
there
more
is-
obvious to me if it's
Right.
done that way, that it's
there
easier to
is
understand.
nothing included in this document right now that's being planned to be transferred to reserves. Now, that doesn't mean that at the end of next year, if our legal fees come in at 50,000 and we budgeted 105, there's 55,000, would we put that in the reserve? If we had to do that to meet our 4% and our legal requirements, we would do that. But that's still done in open session. So, you know.
So there would be no harm then in saying as a line item that we are not planning on, in this budget, we are not planning on transferring any money to reserves.
That's correct.
Okay.
We've not built money into this budget to
Okay.
fund reserves.
So there's no 4% in there?
The 4% is a separate bank account, Carla. It's not factored into this at all.
Okay.
4% is sitting invested. It's not identified here. You're referring to the unappropriated fund balance. Unappropriated means you can hang on to 4% by law without designating what you're going to spend it on. We have that money in the bank.
Can I say that another way?
It's identified on our trial balance, I believe.
This is our checking account. That other fund is our savings account.
Right. But I didn't know if we had to show it on.
No, but it'll be part of our reserve, the next slide that I go to.
Okay.
And it's, been included in our presentation for the last 3 or 4 years. It's now the trial balance that's posted on our website. It's included in that number every month.
So Greg, now that you've heard that concern and you understand it, what do you think the recommendation is to the board?
For,
To add a line that says money for the reserves and then put a line item of 0? Is that what you're thinking?
I think if we ever get into a situation where the board has a capital plan and we start gearing up for it, and it's strictly identified at the beginning, I don't see a harm in doing it that way.
So with this budget, are you thinking putting something in?
No, because, we could add the line, but it's going to be 0.
That's
Right.
That was Ron's point.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
We
I'm
do
sorry.
have-
Just
I
so
know,
people
budget
know it's
goes up
there.
here.
So they
So are
understand
you
the
thinking it
strategy.
now?
So, and then I'll take it one step further.
Tom, you're looking like you're uncomfortable. What are you thinking?
Well, currently, the structure that is on your appropriation status report, and that's what this document is, there is no New
Budget
York
code.
State uniform system of accounts for school districts. budget code for a reserve and a budget line item. So currently, there's no code to actually put it in this document there. It would be done differently, not necessarily on this document.
So the state wants us to do it, but
So
they
the
don't
state-
give
yeah,
us a
that
way
was
to
my
do it.
Which doesn't make sense.
Can we just put it in the information that's mailed out to the voters, a statement about the use of reserves?
Sure,
That-
absolutely.
I mean, as long as it's on that would cover it, I would think.
So
Yeah.
Tom, codes like the F fund, that is on a separate document, or is it,
Well, the different funds are all separate fund structures by it's the accounting and reporting manual for New York State school districts. So you have your general fund, your special aid fund, your federal fund, your school lunch fund. All of those funds are separately identified, and there are separately identified codes that are specific, and your appropriation status report is based on those identified codes in the Uniform System of Accounts or the accounting reporting manual.
The one that is included, though, is capital. And the reason you see 85,000, if you remember, that was a proposition on our vote. It wasn't part of our original budget, but it was a separate proposition for the playground. The voters approved it, so that shows up there. So capital is the one slight exception to that, but as Tom said, we follow the Uniform System of Account codes. But clearly, information in some format.
Capital component doesn't have a budget code number to it, does it? Or are you looking at transfer to capital?
Transfer capital.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I see.
Greg, of the 1.6 million increase, how much of that increase, that 1.6 million, is going to go to the teacher retirement system as opposed to this year's budget? How much more are we going to have to spend to?
Oh, it's
for
in
the-
there. So
I can tell you.
it is one of the
Overall
lines.
for, because that's one of the things, overall for benefits, we're up about $400,000 now. That doesn't break out ES
Okay.
or ERS, but overall for benefits, which I think are all contractually defined,
Ron,
in
our
instruction,
TRS,
we're up for about $400,000.
right, our TRS number is slated to go up roughly $130,000.
So if everyone's on page 12,
Yeah.
This is what it is currently.
teacher retirement,
Okay.
teacher retirement system. And you can see the difference between this
How much
number
did you
and
say?
that number.
130.
And ERS, didn't you say ERS was going down?
ERS actually is going up 6,275.
I didn't intend that into that. That's what I was talking.
That's on the same page.
What page?
Page 12. So ERS is currently this, and we're projecting to spend that. And if you look at that, you see in the expense column for ERS, 820,000. And what you need to understand is the retirement system works on a April 1st to a March 31st timeframe. So what you see expensed currently is only 9 months of our expense. It's July 1st through March 31st. We will have 3 more months of expense that we won't be billed for until next year, but we will accrue that expense because based on the modified accrual basis of accounting, even though we're not paying it until next year, we've earned that expense. So we have to
Next year
recognize it in
when?
our financial statements.
Next year when?
Next year it'll be, we get the bill in March, but we will accrue 3 months of that bill out of this budget, and then next year, 9/12 of the bill will be expensed.
Okay, so let me get this right then. You took and carried over 3 months from last year
No.
into this year for last year?
No, what we did was, we expensed 3 months of the cost. It's not done as an encumbrance, it's done as an accrual. So we put it down as, we recognize the expense, and we put it down as a liability that it's an accounts payable. We owe that money. We haven't paid it yet, but we owe it. An encumbrance is, we've ordered it, we haven't paid for it, different thing.
Okay, all right. I think I got
Accrual
the-
based, modified accrual basis of accounting, just like with the tax levy is a perfect example. The minute the board accepts the tax, adopts the tax levy on a revenue report on September 1st, the first day of collection, we recognize the entire tax levy as revenue. We haven't collected it yet,
Yeah,
but we've earned it.
right.
So same concept, but do that on the expense side. we have 3 months, we have April, May, and June of ERS expense. The bill won't be paid until next March, but 3 months of that expense comes from this school year. So by accounting standards, you recognize that expense in this school year.
Do you have to accrue it all at once, or do you accrue it month by month as you incur the liability?
I believe the treasurer will accrue that at the end of June as part of the closing process.
Okay.
We could do it month by month, Karen, but just as easy to wait and do it as part of the closing process. But that's why you see, one of the questions I think from Mr. Myler was, geez, the budget is $1.2 million, you've only spent $880,000. Well, that's because we haven't spent our entire amount yet. We still have 3 months to go. So that accounts for that.
Greg, you made a comment on if the amount that we're over the 4%, maybe we would put it in reserves. Okay, now that would be if the reserves aren't at the caps that we kind of were recommended to us?
Correct.
Okay, so if they're already at capped, the amount that we were suggested to have them at, then we would probably return it money.
But there's only one that has a cap. That's
Yeah, when you say cap, Tim, we had a recommendation to put 5 years' worth of expenditure totals in there.
right.
Right.
And then this year, we had planned on using it, but we had the leftover money last year, so we carried that all over. So now the 5-year really gets pushed out another year. So it's really an internal cap. It's not really a state cap. There are certain ones that there are state limits on, but it's really more of an internal cap in conjunction with a corrective action plan. But if we were to put money into one of those, it would be a recommendation to the board, done in public session,
Any other questions on the line by line? The next document that we're going to be looking at is the fund balance. So that is a horizontal sheet.
So moving on, this next part of the presentation represents fund balances. And actually, I took this layout right from the executive summary that Ray Wager shared with the audit committee. He shows revenue, expense, and then gets into what he calls equity. But basically, one of the things we talked about was showing our reserve balances, what the usage has been, what the historical piece has been. So we tried to give for you just that. So we've listed all the reserves that we have, starting with unemployment, going down to workers' comp. And we've listed the amounts starting with the year-end balance at 2011. Encumbrances we talked about were items that were ordered out of a budget but had not been received yet, so the money gets carried over. Appropriated for taxes, this was money we had left over in a budget that we appropriate to the next school year to reduce the tax burden. Carla, here's the 4%.
Okay.
So it doesn't show up in the expenditure or revenue report, but it shows up in the financial statements.
Okay.
It's going to show up on the trial balance for that. So these were our balances back in 2011. And if it's got a dash there, that means that that reserve actually wasn't we didn't have that reserve in that year. So you can see that our total equity, $22,882,024. Then you go to 2012, same format. You see that our equity went down $19,573,885. So we were using our bank account.
Looks like most of that came out of capital, correct?
Yes. Yep. Using our bank account, as put it in Karen's terms, to supplement the checking account. And 2013, same thing. We created the tax certiorari reserve. We also created, back in 12, we created workers' comp. This here represents the restructured balances based on the comptroller's report and the corrective action plan that Mr. Reynolds referred to. These are year-end 2013. So these three first columns are all audited numbers right off of our financial statements. And you can see that as part of our plan, the insurance reserve, that number went way down. We reallocated that money to different reserves. We've been using that money to help support the general fund. It's not technically the right use for the reserve. So you can see our retirement for ERS, our workers' comp, our unemployment, those numbers got funded. And then you can see that at the end of the year, we had $518,000 in goods that were ordered, goods and services that we hadn't paid for, so that carries over. So that number's the difference between, on the other document, the budget and the adjusted budget. And then we made the decision as a district that we planned on appropriating $1.2 million to this year to help with taxes. We ended up $1.7 million better than the 1.2. So the decision was made back in August, a recommendation to the board, change our revenue budget, give all this back as an appropriation, not use the reserve money that we planned on, and that's the almost 2.9 million. Once again, the 4% number just is always a calculation of what the budget is, but you can see our equity went from 19.5 down to 19.3. Now what I'm projecting for you is what our balances will be at the end of 2014. And basically right now, these numbers represent what the balances were right off of the February Treasurer's Report.
Off of which one? I'm sorry.
The February Treasurer's Report.
Okay.
So there'll be some interest earnings, but I mean, this is really the gist of what it is. And I'm anticipating we'll have about $550,000. That tends to be right around the number we have of carryover encumbrances. There was other years when it was higher for different reasons, but this is really a true reflection of the district our size. And we will be recommending to you that based on the last fund balance projection, we were counting on 1.2 million to carry over to offset next year's taxes, but then we showed that we were doing $1 million better than that. So our recommendation to you tonight, when I get into the next slides, will be to stay consistent with this theory and appropriate that 2.2 million back to the taxpayers.
Can you,
And I'll get into that further in the revenue sheet, but go ahead.
what did you just say?
I'll get into
At
that
the
more in
last
the
board
revenue.
meeting, when I did the fund balance projection,
After that.
it showed that we were going to allocate 1.2 million,
Right.
and then it showed an excess of $1,067,000 above the 1.2.
Right.
So that really means that we're doing 2.2 million left over at the end of the year. We planned on 1.2. So we're actually doing $1 million better than what we projected.
Right.
So what I'm saying now is, let's stay consistent with what we did here, appropriate that full amount back to the taxpayers. We're going to be recommending to you not to raise the levy, second year in a row, which would drive our tax rate down a little bit based on estimated assessments. And it also gets us, originally we were using the maximum amount of our reserve money based on our ERS expense, unemployment, and workers' comp. We're still going to use about 1.1 million, but we're starting to wean ourselves off of that need because, remember, that can create a funding cliff. We're using that one-time money to fund those expenses. If we fund the expenses at 100% the entire time we have the money, it will create a funding cliff. Once the money's gone, those expenses will still be there at the tune of 1.8 million. We have got to, in the next 4 or 5 years, while we're using the reserves, wean ourselves off of that, and we think that would allow us to do that. But once again, this would show that we're using the bank account to go down. And then in next year's budget, we're recommending using $75,000 for unemployment. Originally that was $85,000. The 217 is the tax cert case that we have with Tractor Supply. That's our estimated exposure. This is the bus purchase here that the board just approved at the last meeting that will pay for the buses in August. Initially we were saying 1.3 million from the ERS reserve, now we're saying 1 million. 5,000 from our EBLR. EBLR covers when employees retire, if there's things that they're owed contractually, we can take those out of this reserve. And workers' comp dropped that from 300 to 223. So this column shows you our budgeted usage for next year. And without any interest earnings or anything, we would end up going from 18 down to 15. And remember, our plan was let's use our fund balance while the state aid numbers are slowly rising back up to the levels they were 4 years ago, because we had a $2 million hole. But this shows you the history of the fund balances from 11 up to the present, and even projecting next year. We've never projected a year ahead, but we thought it was, for purposes of tonight, it was a good thing to show that.
Carla, do you have a question?
Yeah, with the, what'd you call it, Ebola?
Ebelar.
Employee
Ebelar?
benefit.
Okay. These are all like really high. This is what you,
This is the balance. These are
Right,
balances,
these are the
Carla.
balance,
This
right.
is how much we're going to use of the balance.
so this will be what's left.
That's correct. That is correct.
Okay, what do you usually, I mean, that depends on how many people
Depends on how many
retire?
people retire and what contract they retire under.
All right, does this district have a drop dead date that they have to
Yep.
put in there? And what is that from?
February 1st.
February 1st.
Okay, so you already know who's retiring and who's,
Yep.
and what they're entitled to, sick days and career award and all that, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Can I ask
So-
a question? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
No, go ahead.
You said the what was it? 606 was for the buses?
Yes.
So is that capital, that balance is, I thought there was a separate reserve for the buses.
Yeah.
On the treasurer's report, there's a separate reserve called out as a bus reserve.
Yeah.
But on the financial reports, a bus reserve is just like a capital reserve. So they lump them together under the
So does that
financial
balance
statements.
both of those?
That balance is, yes, both the bus reserve
And the regular
and the capital reserve that's
Okay.
left. That's correct.
Thank
How
you.
many buses does $600,000 buy?
4 large,
And
2
two
small,
6.
and 1 car.
Yes.
For you?
Now, the car, we use the car for the first 2 years for transportation.
It was.
So we get aid on it, and then we turn it over to the driver ed program.
Driver ed.
Yeah. Yep.
And we
Yes.
still don't charge for driver ed, right?
We still don't charge for driver's ed.
Is
Yes,
this-
Jeremy?
Okay. Is this like, you and I spoke last year,
Yep.
you explained it to me, here's our circle of our budget, and there's gonna be a hole at the end. This year, we didn't have to use much reserves to fill the hole because we had money in the budget to plug that hole.
Yep.
Is that the same kind of deal that we're talking about right here?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
there's a hole in our circle, hopefully, well, not.
We want to make the
we
hole
wanna
get
use
smaller and
reserves, but
smaller.
we might not have to use it.
Yeah.
I got it.
Okay. To you, I have a question. What? I
think it's Tom.
Tom, sorry. A lovely tie, by the way. For a district our size, what should our total fund balance be?
Very good question.
Thank you.
Girls, don't be shy, come up, keep coming up.
Here's
bring 'em
front
up
row
here.
seating.
There you go, it's just like church, you come in right, sit up front.
There really is no standard, this is what you should have in reserves that's written down in the law, anything like that. So really it starts with what types of needs the school district has. And the reserve levels are going to vary depending on what your long-term plan is.
Right.
Because you may have a very significant capital need, so you have a lot in capital reserves, okay? And those capital reserves aren't anything that the board controls, the voters control those. So if you have a high capital need or are planning on a big capital project, you may have a higher total fund balance, the fund balance and reserves. So for the most part, it really is dependent on the needs. That's why a reserve plan is very important in developing a reserve plan and understanding what is our reserve plan. How does the board review and acknowledge the reserve plan on an annual basis? I know Moody's is out there, and when they look at the reserves and so forth, they like to see more than anywhere between 14 and 20% in total fund balance and reserves when they're looking to rate a municipality. I know last year or 2 years ago, they just came out with a document shortly after the tax cap was put in place. That document talked about the fact that school districts that have developed their reserves as part of their long-term plan will be able to deal with the tax cap going forward, and will actually be able to sustain a long-term plan much better than school districts that don't have reserves. So the first thing you have to look at is, what is the board's goal? What is the board's plan in terms of the reserves? And then, what does the industry look at a reasonable fund balance is?
And our facilities preservation project, that's all been accounted for and everything. That's not part of this, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Where are we on the Moody's? If you said that they like, that for their rating scale, they like to be between 14 and 18%.
14 and 18%?
We have,
The total budget?
when we did our borrowing, the last borrowing we did, when we refinanced our debt, I think it was 2 summers ago, we have the second highest rating a school district can have in their state. We're an A2, I think A1, and I might
So
not
we
have
probably,
the acronyms
we're going
right,
to fall
but
in between those percentages, I
but-
assume.
Pittsford is at the highest, they're A1. We are A2, and if you look at the difference between the 2 ratings, it's nominal.
So it doesn't cost you any interest points when you go out and borrow money?
Correct. Correct.
You got it.
And that's, part of our response to the comptroller through a lot of that criticism was, but that we had a great credit rating, it helped us with our bonding, so there's, more to it than that.
So is this the happy medium now, where we're at? When you look at that last number, will that be like the happy medium where you want to stay until we decide to do a capital something? That 15?
I don't have any preconceived number, Carla. My approach has always been, when my administrators come and need a teacher, if the board, as a young board, needs legal help, if we need uniforms for one of our sports teams, that we meet the need, but that we also take into serious consideration our community's ability to fund the program. And we try to strive for that balance.
Carl,
Perfect.
I've never met a business manager that didn't want to keep more, so that they could meet the needs when the building administrator walks down and say, hey, I need this.
Right.
So
But
they
this-
always want to keep more.
But that number was probably too much.
In the beginning,
Yeah.
I would say.
When the capital project went down,
When
to
the capital
have that was
project,
too much.
here's what I said numerous times. The capital project vote went down, the funding plan worked. We ended up with a lot of money, and what we tried to do with the money was meet our long-term needs in a different way. So the reason you see this encumbrance amount this high for a district our size, we bought 2 new driver ed cars. We bought a cube van for the food service program. We bought Bob Miller a $75,000 tractor. We bought the big loader that you see out there with the buckets for plowing. We started our furniture replacement in the buildings. We stopped that because there was some criticism there. We did smart boards. We did things to give us future budget relief. So even though the project went down, we still tried to follow the same logic in how can we help further Wayne Central as a school district.
So we used the money, not so much to build a new building or to do that, but to
Right, we
meet
used the
other
money
needs.
right, we tried to use it for the same intent, but in a different fashion. We didn't build a new building, we didn't close a building, but we gave ourselves future budget relief. Because that tractor would have needed to be bought in one of these years. Those smart boards would have needed to be bought. That curriculum money would have needed to be put into the budget. The one thing I think people should remember is, when we have money left over, you as a board member you don't get any of it, I don't get any of it. It's there for future needs. So through the state's whole rocky economic cycle, if you look at Wayne Central, our budget's been very stable, and our tax rate's actually gone down. If we didn't have some of this, that would not have occurred.
Right.
And were you just going to say this?
I don't know.
Saw you taking a breath. And we just saw a report that just came out on Channel 13 and WHAM where districts are crumbling under the financial stress all around us, not a couple.
Right. And we're one of the few districts that has added some program and not cut massively to our program by choice.
I think a good question for all of us to really think about, not necessarily tonight or now, but when you see that number, like you said, Carla, going from 22 down to 15, the FPP is taking care of a lot of our issues, but there's going to be more in 5
Right.
years. There's
Yeah.
going to be more in 10 years. So, at some point, we had that capital reserve at 5 million. It's capped at that, correct?
Correct.
At some point, we're going to need to get that back up because things are going to come up that we're going to have to work on. So I think that that's
Agreed.
something we need to consider for the future.
Yeah.
Well, I
And
just
think that has-
didn't know where Greg felt the
So,
happy
Carla-
medium was.
Recently, Canandaigua, my colleague at Canandaigua sent out an email, and her board was interested in what other districts had in fund balance. And what my colleagues are looking at is just this block of here, not down
Because
here.
that ain't going to get us.
So these numbers here.
Okay.
Gananda was the low responder at about $2 million. North Rose was the highest at over 13 million. Canandaigua had 10, Pelmac had 9. Dundee, and I don't know the exact size of their budget, but I'd say if it's 50% of ours, that's a lot. They have 11. So the point is, it's really an individual district choice based on the direction of the board and the long-range financial plan and what the mission is of the district and what the community can afford.
And isn't it fair to say, although you may not feel it's fair, to be fair, that the perception was that our reserves got a little high? And even the comptroller said, they're a little high. And the plan, the corrective action plan, has been to start to chip away at those reserves, and that in fact has happened. Isn't that a fair statement? In addition to, last year we gave money back to the taxpayers. And what are we planning on doing this year?
Same thing.
Which is what?
Last year it was like 20 cents a thousand, right?
Oh, you mean not, so.
We gave money back last year.
Right,
What are we planning to do this year?
Give money back.
give money back.
There you
Not
go.
quite as much.
The other part of the comptroller's report was looking at realigning the reserves with the actual expenditure amounts. So before, and when you look at this chart, you can clearly see in 2011, the insurance reserve was at $6.2 million. When we realigned the reserve, some of that money came out of that reserve, and we looked at actual expenditures, for example, in the retirement contribution or the ERS reserve. We then projected out, as Greg said, 5 years and realigned it based on actual expenditures. So that's been a key part of realigning our reserves and addressing those concerns.
Because that one's gone up.
Correct.
Right. And because of the realignment.
But that was because we had money in insurance that wasn't really supposed to be there. It should have
Well,
been in a different
the money was
reserve.
supposed to be there, but when we were saving up for the project that shall not be named, in 2010, our capital reserve only allowed us to have 5 million. We had put the 5 million in. We needed, that financial plan called for us using $17 million. So as we were building up the other money that we needed, we were putting it into this reserve, because this reserve, you can put 5% a year of your budget into this reserve. So that's why that number got so high, because this is where the balance, besides the 5 million capital reserve, was for the project. The lion's share of that money was here
So 5% is like $2 million?
annually,
Annually.
not once it's in
How
there.
many of you figured that out that quick, huh? Huh?
And we said at the time,
Contract.
once that project was voted down, and then the state economy fell apart, we said our plan was to use this money to protect our program. That was the strategy. Now, the comptroller's criticism was, that's not what this reserve is set up for. Agreed. I will agree. But if it came to coming to you and recommending cutting 30 teachers, or using that money and taking an audit comment hit, I'll take the audit comment hit every day, because we are here for kids. What the restructuring has done is taken this available money that was extra after the plan went down, put it into reserves that are appropriate to use to give us budget relief
For that need.
for that.
Okay.
So Greg, I just wanted to make a comment just to maybe put some of this in perspective for people. I think when people in the community and other people hear, oh, we had $1 million left over at the end of the year, or between what we planned to be over and what we were over $2.2 million for it. That sounds like a heck of a lot of money. And if you're talking about your household budget, you know, I think most of us would love to have that for a budget, just what we were over. But if you compare that percentage-wise to if you had $1,000 budget for your home, that would be like having $20 to $40 left at the end of your budget. And so to be able to manage $1,000 to within $20 or $40 is, I think, pretty good. But it just, because you start out with a big number, saying $1 million sounds like a huge amount of money. And I think sometimes, you know, we hear that number and we say, how could anybody be $1 million off? But when you're dealing with all of those variables that are entailed in a $42 to $44 million budget, as a percentage, it's really not, it's pretty tough to manage just to being within that amount. And I say that because, you know, the budget I manage where I work is actually larger than the school budget, and it would be really tough to be able to be that tight. So it's not just the school budget. I mean, that's something that carries over between the private and the public sector.
Does the board have any other questions on the fund balance report that you see in front of you?
I just have a couple comments.
Sure.
What I like is on the assigned part where it says encumbrances, and they were 2 million down to 1 million, down to 518,000, down to 550,000. That was what things were spent that were carried over. And so not as much has been carried over. So it looks like there's been a good change of philosophy on how we did things. If you look at 2013, there was a split between what increased and what didn't, but that was a reallocation, correct? 2013 changed some of the numbers around. And then
Yes,
2014, everything is going up from 2013. So we're maintaining those reserves, which is what we want to do. We don't want to overfund them, we don't want to underfund them, we want to find the happy medium. So that's what I like looking at that sheet.
I think it gives you some good historical data to make sure we're on target with what we talked about.
Do we have a drop dead date for purchasing too, so that we get less stuff to be encumbered? Like, do you just say, unless it's an absolute emergency, you need to spend what you have, you know, principals need to, that's it?
Depends on who my superintendent is. When I first came here, we used to cut off spending usually in February or March. But that was driven more by, they didn't want to carry stuff over, they didn't want to have POs to carry over.
Right.
When our former superintendent, Mr. Havens, came on board, there was a couple of years when we had lean budget years where we did shut off spending. And when we say we shut it off for like some of the buildings. We said, listen, if you need it, don't, you know, if you're going to do a lab in April, order it now in February. Because we're trying to figure out where we're going to be at the end of the year. It doesn't really apply to maintenance and transportation because they don't need it until something's broken. But then, when we were ending up with money left over, he said, why should we restrict our people from buying things that they need? So it's actually, Carla, come all over the place. I've seen it in different ways.
It's just nice to have so few encumbrances that you need to encumber after July 1st, because, I mean, face it, the teachers, everybody should know what they need to get them through the last couple months of school. And it should be done and over with so that you have less there.
Right. You know, it's part of what I call managing your fund balance. You know, what you have is one thing, but then managing it is a whole other piece. You know, it's no different than your own personal income. You make so much, but then how do you manage that? You spend it all, you set some aside, you know, how do you do that?
Disappears quickly.
Yeah. Any other questions on this piece?
No. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Next sheet is the revenue sheet, option 1, which actually has 2 sheets, and then option 2 has 2 sheets. So option 1's in the right-hand corner, and then you'll see 2 sheets for option 2.
Okay.
We're going to start with option 1.
Do you have my copies of those ones?
So we start with option 1.
Should we lay these out side by side so we can see?
You can if you want. It won't make total sense, Carla, until I get to the second one, but obviously you can do that. So this is option 1. I had to scroll it up so you can see the bottom number, but as you can see, this is our revenue budget. once again, this number matches what you saw on the appropriation side, 44, 488, 715. Similar format, we show you 4 years' worth of activity. This is money that comes from the state of New York, the top category. This is what we classify as other, which encompasses sales tax, interest earnings, pilot payments, which is payment in lieu of taxes, any reserve usage that we're planning on doing. Then it goes down to appropriated fund balance, what the proposed levy would be, and the total. So option 1 shows you that previously at the last board meeting, the appropriated number was at 1.2. But when we went over where we were with our fund balance projection, we said we think we're going to end up $1 million better than that. So we revised that and said, similar to what we did here, give it back to the taxpayers, 2.2. And initially, up here, we had $1.3 million from the ERS reserve, 85,000, and I believe this number was 2 or 230. We've lowered those a little bit, so we're still using our reserves to fund that, but not at 100%. We're trying to wean off. And the important number is, option 1 recommends no tax levy increase. So we raise the same amount of money from taxpayers as we currently are. And we've gotten some preliminary assessment numbers. And if the preliminary assessment numbers hold, our tax rate would go down 0.64%. or 13 cents per thousand. And I tell you, that's preliminary because those assessment numbers are not finalized until late July or early August.
Historically, Greg, how accurate are those estimates?
They're pretty close historically.
You're comfortable with it then?
Right. In other years, if the assessment was going up 20 million, we would count on maybe 15. This is a little bit more aggressive, but if we don't end up with the 2.2, we can always bring in a little bit more money from reserves. We don't have to adjust the tax levy. By moving this down from the maximum that it was at, it gives us about $400,000 in ability to, if this number came in short 200,000, to bring in 200,000 more there and still not affect the tax levy.
Do they let you know if they're doing any reassessments or anything like that? Neither town, I don't think, is. At least I pray they're not.
Well, I think they do it every 2 years now. They're required, I think, by law to do it every 2 years, I believe. That's my understanding, but
Yeah, I think it's every 2. We have 5 townships, or
we actually have 6.
6 townships.
So, any questions on that? Because, and I can always flip back to this.
Just a correlation to make with your line-by-line document. When you turn to page 12, you will see what our projected and actual costs were for the employees' retirement system. So you can see our employees, our transfer from the retirement reserve is not actually matching our expenditures are projected. And the same with the workers' compensation.
But it's a little lower now.
So you can see that we could take 316 out of reserves to fund that,
Right.
or we could take about 271 out of reserves to fund that. But option 1, you're not doing that, Mr. Adseth, because you have a couple concerns. One is how accurate are our fund balance projections, right?
Right, right. I mean, it's still, we still have 3 months of the year to go.
Right.
So, this is a pretty aggressive strategy, but we feel comfortable because if by chance the 2.2, like you could say it comes in at 2 million, we can always take a little bit more from one of the reserves, not be bringing in more than what our expense is, so not violating any accounting principles, and still be able to hold the tax levy at the number it's currently at. So to summarize that,
So do you want us to look at option 2 now?
Not yet, hold on.
He's trying to find this page.
Okay.
That's
So, to summarize, option 1, budget $44,488,715 represents a 3.95% spending increase. Tax levy stays the same, so the increase is 0. Estimated tax rate would go from 2068 down to 2055. And I stress estimated because, like I said, those numbers are not finalized until late summer. That represents a 0.64% decrease or in cents, it's 13-cent decrease on the levy.
So if I have 100, a home that's worth 100,000, my actual bill could go down $130.
Carl, is that correct?
I don't think it's that much. I think it's $13. isn't it?
$13?
$13.
Oh,
Yeah.
I have to
Yeah,
get
13.
it.
Wow.
That still sounds.
Hey, I'm sure everybody
It would
asks
be a
when
million.
something's on sale. How much is 40%? She's got it. No, I think it's $13.
Any questions on option one?
It was
Good try, though.
$20, so it was 13.
Does this go along with what was talked about in the, on the TV today and that? Does this go along
Oh, the
with
cap
that?
elimination
Yeah,
adjustment?
you have a 0%.
That's really, when Greg starts talking about, go ahead,
Later on.
Greg.
Yeah, let me.
If it's coming on later on, just go
Yeah.
quick.
Well,
Yeah.
Tim, I can cover it in the next slide,
Yeah.
because that's a good point that you bring up. So let me show you option two.
Get it out there, too. I know it's here.
Is it 130 or 13?
Okay, this is option two, and I probably should have said this
I went
earlier.
to Wayne Central.
These numbers from the state are based on the governor's proposed budget. We do not have a final state budget yet. If we have an on-time state budget, that would give us time to react to that change, if there is a change, because we adopt on April 10th, and the state's target date is April 1st. So these are the governor's estimated numbers.
And that basic formula includes the gap elimination worked into it?
That's the net, that's correct. That's correct. So when we hear about the gap elimination, 4 or 5 years ago, when New York State was in trouble, they ran the formulas and said, well, by formula, Wayne Central's supposed to get 16 million. But guess what? We could only afford 14 million. So they let the formulas run to show you what that was. They knew what the bottom number was they could afford, and they put a negative number in there to balance it. So we took a $2 million hit in state aid in 1 year. Now, because of our financial position, we were able to absorb that without doing massive program and staff cuts. If the state budget's approved on time, these numbers could change. I don't see the building aid number changing. If anything could change, it might be that top number, because the building aid is really based on the money you're spending on your capital projects, but that number could go up. It's interesting to note, though, if we have an approved state budget, they give us new numbers. But what the numbers represent is that what they just approved in funding formulas applied to year-old data. The actual aid Wayne will receive will not be known until November of next year, because we don't finish our school year up to June 30th. We spend the summer, we're closing our books. We do the ST3, which is our year-end financial report that we send into the state. They then take the current data, put it into the approved funding formulas, and in the fall, we get what our actual state aid will be. So state aid is a very fluid number. But this is the best number that we have currently.
How close were we this year with what you projected with what we got?
The last 2 years, Carla, we were $600,000 over and $300,000 over on just the aid pieces.
They gave us more? Than
More.
what we thought?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep,
If you're gonna err, that's a good way to err.
Yeah.
Yeah.
correct. Correct.
Yeah.
So the difference between option two and option one, I said we had some assessment growth. We could raise our levy about $130,000 to 19 million aid. So the levy increase would be, I think it's 0.64%. The tax rate would stay the same as it currently is, $20.68. We would still use the 2.2 million, but if we brought in a little more in tax revenue, we would adjust our reliance on one-time money. We would deduct that up here and reduce this by about $137,000. So still keeps the tax rate at what it currently is. The tax rate is one of the components of your tax bill. It's your assessed value times the tax rate, and we do not control the assessed value, we control the rate. But the part that we would control would stay the same, because we have either increased assessments or new properties that have generated higher assessment. So we could go up to 19.8 and leave the tax rate the same. So a slight levy increase, bring in a little bit of tax money, get us a little bit less reliant on this one-time money. That's option 2.
So Greg, when we tell the town what the levy is, or what's been approved by the voters, do we tell them a percent or a dollar amount? Or can we do either?
We tell the town what this number is. We actually tell the county what this number is here.
Okay.
And then they put that into the tax program that has all the tax roll information, which has every property listed that's in Wayne Central's borders, and then applies the tax rate calculation. I also send them a tax rate calculation, so it applies that rate per thousand, which has the total number on it. They plug that information into the tax program and they print the tax bills.
Okay, if somebody doesn't pay their taxes, obviously, if a, huge building or a huge company or something didn't pay their taxes, then we're affected by this?
The county, we are not, because the county makes us whole in January, and then they add it to your county tax bill.
Okay.
And then if you don't pay that, then they come and foreclose your property. Or come after you. So we're in a fortunate position because the county makes us whole if somebody doesn't pay us for the school tax bill.
Okay. And
So
then
the
if
county has the ability to go and do foreclosure, which we do not.
Is that also true on the pilots, Greg?
You know, Ron, that's a good question. I'm not really sure because the pilots are special agreements.
Yeah.
But I think if people are late, they run the risk of voiding the pilot. We could always call Peg Churchill and the
IDEA.
IDEA.
Well, the reason I ask is because of the Medley Center.
Yeah.
And they're obviously late, and it's having an impact upon school taxes in East Arundecoy.
Yes.
And we have a couple of pilots.
Yes, yes. We have had some that have been late, not too many. One in particular, I've made 3 phone calls 2 years in a row. You try to be a good neighbor, but at some point in time, you might have to call IDEA and say, hey, they're not living up to the agreement, and then IDEA will step in.
Is IDEA similar to Comida? Is that like a counterpart with Comida in Monroe County?
I think so. I think so. It's the Industrial Development Agency or...
Similar?
Yes.
So the difference in a pilot versus regular taxation on your property is that if they don't pay it, the county's not covering it. You don't get the income from the county for a pilot if they don't pay it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure because it's never happened to us, man.
Okay.
You could be right. I don't know.
No, it's a question, it's not a
Yeah.
statement.
Probably have to
I would
ask the
think it would be
county.
the same, but I'd have to double check because I think the county always has the ability, especially since they're entering into the agreement, to void the agreement, and then if a business doesn't pay their taxes, just like a residential, that they're gonna come and foreclose and take over the property. So I think penalties tend to be the same, but just through a different avenue.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or they're going to pay more because the pilot's going to go away and they're going to be paying on the full
Correct.
day.
Correct.
Full assessed
They're
value.
encouraged to
Right.
make
Yeah.
the payment.
So usually the pilot people are pretty good because it's a
It's
good
to
deal
their
for them.
advantage.
It's usually a win-win situation, so I haven't seen a violation of that too much.
So any new business that would come in any one of our entities that pay into us would help us with revenue as well?
Correct. We had a new track going in Walworth. That's going to add to our assessment value.
But there's a delay when they go on the tax rolls.
Yeah, it depends. There's a timing piece, Carla. I think it's got to be in by, and I'm going by Monroe County, you usually got to know by March for it to get in, even though the roll's not closed until like July or April, or July or August.
So,
But then they catch up with them. If you're not in the first year, you might pay at the, say you buy somebody's house, you might pay at the old rate, but then once your transaction goes through the system, they'll adjust and they'll catch up with you.
so basically the bottom line here is these two options. We're gonna spend 4% more as a district, just under 4% more, and the taxpayers aren't gonna feel any of that.
That's correct.
So Greg, can you go to the next sheet? Option 2's next sheet. So we're going to need to get some kind of direction from you as a board, so I'm sure you're thinking in your mind the benefits of each one.
And to summarize is that it's option 2, we're actually using a piece of our reserves.
So option 2.
Retirement reserve, that's the difference between the two.
Yeah, option 2, once again, total budget, this part stays the same. Tax levy goes up slightly, 0.65% increase, and the tax rate stays at what it currently is at $20.68. So a 0% increase on the rate, slight increase on the levy. Option 1 was a levy, the levy was at 0 and the rate went down. Roughly, I think 0.64%.
So Greg, what I was trying to get at with my question earlier, and I think I actually asked it incorrectly, the taxpayers don't vote on the levy, they vote on the budget,
Correct.
right? So if we, let's say we put the levy number into the town and they came back and said, oh, property values haven't risen as much as we had all estimated that they would, so that would actually cause a tax increase. We could ask them to lower the number to keep the tax rate whole or the same.
Once the board has approved this expenditure level, if that estimated increase were to completely go away, if the board decided not to take it out of reserves, the board could adjust what these numbers are.
Okay.
I mean, I would urge that there would be a lot of communication to the public so they understood why. But when people vote, they give us the right to spend this total dollar amount to run Wayne Central. You've heard some comments in the past, you know, why are you spending more on legal fees? We didn't authorize that. Well, in all due respect, that's a district decision. What people authorize is this dollar amount right here. Yes, we have components within that, but like I said, they're very fluid. You know, but the board has the option to adjust this if the factors change.
I just don't want to surprise anybody with the tax rate increase, even though that's not an option here. I just want to make sure neither of the options that we select could cause that to happen inadvertently.
So if the estimated assessment increase went away, but Karen, it's $137,000, so I think we could absorb that in our scenario.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand the process with the town better, so we weren't locked into some certain amount of tax levy that might surprise folks when they got the tax bill.
Now, at the last board meeting, we showed you, I think it was a 3% tax levy increase, about $700,000. I didn't put that up as option 3 because we're not recommending it, but obviously it's, you know, it's a board decision if you felt these were too aggressive, but if we didn't have confidence in these options, we wouldn't be recommending them to you.
So what is your sense, Debbie?
I guess if I had to choose, I'm very comfortable with both of them. I kind of like option 2 a little bit better, but I'm comfortable with one as well.
Sure, we can keep right on going. Matt?
Option 1? Matt?
I'm with Debbie. I think they're not substantially different. And, you know, it's not like last year where we were saying tax increase or tax decrease. You know, those were the two options. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure everybody cares about their $13 that Carla was talking about earlier, calculated correctly earlier, but I'm not sure it matters. It's substantially different to the district as a whole, so I can support either decision.
I'm looking a little further than what's just here, and basically we knew what critiques were before, and I was one of the critics. So I just want to make sure we have a budget that, you know, we make sure we got the revenues projected as accurate as possible. The expenditures are as accurate as possible. We have enough fund balance at the end to cover expended or unexpected costs at the end of the year. You know, what we have to feel comfortable what amount is acceptable at the end of the year. Obviously, we know it's not $5 million. Is it down there at $3 million or $2 million, so we can cover those, you know, unexpected costs. So that's something as a whole is our philosophy as a board. Are these in there? and then how much the taxpayers will support. So, we want to support programs we value with the staff and the resources, and we want to make sure the reserves are at the recommended levels, and then look to the future for, do we need money more in reserves in the capital, or start up something new to cover, some of the things that need to be done yearly, or future capital projects. So that's something we need to talk about besides what's here, but both these look good right now, but I just want to make sure that we meet those kind of criteria that we have. Maybe that's be further discussion later, but that's my thoughts on it.
I'm comfortable with either. Again, I think Karen said it perfectly. I could support either one of these. If I was forced to choose, I guess I would, just given the environment, even though it's such a minuscule difference, I think given the environment, I would choose one. But again, I'm comfortable with either one.
I will support either one. I think psychologically, option one might be the better choice for the board at this point, but I will support either one.
I could go either way as well, but I'm looking at 6 of one and a half dozen of another. But when we're not even talking a whole percent. Again, I would probably go option 2, but I could go either way.
I think I'm really happy with the changes that Greg's made, the adjustments, the taking into consideration what the audit committee said, what the budget process has been, what we've asked. I think it's been a huge, it's a little tighter, it's a little more well-wrapped, I guess is how I would look at it. And I look at it, $13, well, actually it would be like maybe $20 for me. It's not. Okay. That isn't going to make or break me, but I look at the people who have, the larger companies, the bigger places, that might look very appetizing to them to get something back. But then we have to look at next year and say, okay, if we've kept it or lowered it, then if we have to raise it, do we say to the voters, we lowered it last year, and now this year we're raising it? Or do we say we kept it flat, but now we have to raise it? I don't know. It all depends on, can that be fine-tuned when you know the state budget?
Oh, absolutely. That'll be the next part of the discussion.
Right.
But just
Okay.
based on what we know right now, are you thinking option 1 or 2? And then I need to come back to Tim.
Everything being equal, I like option 1, but I don't it is nice to show that, because what I hear out in the community is, you said my rates were gonna go down, and then they get that bill, and it didn't go down because their assessment went up. And people sometimes don't get that that's not our fault, that's your town. They set the rate of what your house is worth.
Your rate.
Yeah, your rate
We
did
don't-
go down, your payment went
Your
up because your
payment went
value
up.
went up.
Right, but they
assessment.
set your assessment rate.
Yeah.
We don't.
Right.
So 1 or 2?
1,
Okay.
I guess.
Tim, back to you.
Back to me. I'll go with 1.
Okay, so it sounds like we have a majority of the board support for option 1. Mr. McTighe, if it pleases the board and you would like to take a break for student release, that would
This is
be
a good time.
okay?
This is a good time. All right, absolutely. We will, all the students, bring your forms up, we'll sign them, and then let's get right back into this, because we're burning candle at both ends.
You guys sat through a very dull but very important meeting.
Any board member, come on up, any board member. Greg, push on over, girls. Come on over, girls. Right over here, anybody.
I'll take that from you.
I'll take one.
Hi, how are you?
We need form.
Is there any other agendas out there? Rob or no?
Yeah, 2.
We'll get you one.
Thank you.
They need agenda.
They need it.
Yeah, I guess.
Senior?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna try and go to MTC.
Here, you can take mine, I don't need it.
That doesn't go away. Leave your money. Bank, bring it up.
Taking notes?
You're all signed?
You're welcome.
Really good inside. You better be. Very grueling curriculum. You are welcome. You got in it at Albany? Yeah. Very good. So my GPA here.
Bye, buddy.
Thank you. Don't enjoy your fraternity and study hard. Good luck.
Jeremy, nice to meet you.
I was trying to remember.
I don't think we accept it right now.
What's your name?
So, hang on to it.
Thanks, Tom, for answering those questions. So learning curve
And then
for all.
we'll go from there.
Yes.
We're working with all the legal entities to figure to walk through this.
Building lot.
So bear with us. Okay, thank you.
I just got to go and stretch, or I'm going to be stiffer than stiff.
We've got all kinds of chairs now.
It's our diehard favorite.
Yeah.
He's the poster boy for my tax bill went up.
So, Jerry, I don't know if you were here earlier, but did you get the answers you wanted to your questions? Because I asked you, I don't know if you were here, I asked.
I was here. Cut that, keep that level. I'm struggling. How are you? I heard what he said about accruals. Greg, accruals are a balance sheet item. It's still got to show up on an expense report.
No,
Correct, that's correct. Where was last year's? Last year's was expensed once. No, where's, and that's what your note to me said, is it gets expensed in December.
No, it wasn't expensed once.
Yeah,
I showed you the
sometime.
timing. If you looked at the year-end report, you see one number, but the timing's the same. The ERS, you're gonna see expense in March, and then you're gonna see the number change.
So then tell me what it didn't show up on last year's expense.
I tried to get your attention a couple times, but I'm like,
$400,000.
I'm like, forget it.
And
He's like, oh.
the second payment isn't, even if, like I said, an accrual is a balance sheet item.
But the fact that there was $400,000 left in the budget didn't mean that there wasn't two payments.
I
It
understand
meant that
that.
the budget had, or.
I understand that. So you're telling me we had a 25% increase over last year?
Actually, I thought it was 19% was what we said ERS was going up year over year.
Off his projection. I want to ask what the actual is.
I'd have to look at the audit report to tell you, I don't have it.
Well, it's not, it's an item that's been.
Tom, do you have our, he's got it right there.
I did not say that.
And the other part
I'm not
of the
around. Why
budget,
is that?
So I just heard we're planning on underrunning this year's budget by $2.2 million.
Well, we planned on underrunning it by 1.2. And then our state aid is actually like $1 million higher than we expected, so that's the other number.
So I understand that. So now we're going to underrun it by $2.2 million. And yet we're projecting a $1.8 million increase. That's $4 million over what we actually spent. That's 10% more than what we're spending.
So let me show you what I
understand what you're saying.
yeah.
You know, you can say what you want.
Keep that in the back of the.
And by the way, I added up the salary figures that are in the budget.
Yeah, it's only, I did assume so.
About 510,000.
No, 200K for regular teaching, 400K for special ed, 300,000 for computers, and another 400,000 for benefits. So maybe you group that in. And
That's where I think we.
so altogether, that's like 1.5 million out of the 1.69 going up.
is
35 for
everybody?
instruction, 400 from administration.
Where are you going?
33, sorry, program, 33.9 to 35.4.
Sales at swings.
Yeah, so did I back here to get the details under instruction, so 200K for teaching, 400K for special ed, 300K, so I mean, yeah, okay, that's only 900K, but I go get
There's the match.
and then, but then capital came down 300, so it offsets.
It's just,
And
she wouldn't have let us go, or deal. I'm like,
in the administration.
when I saw all those kids coming, I'm like,
Take it off. No, make it
That was driven by 70,000 in Louisville, 20K because the board wants to do the new tool. Data processing, 200,000 and 70,000 of both.
The budget that's being proposed is still 10%.
Yeah, but on the other side, it actually spends between
oh,
families.
they were all like, they piled them.
I can't figure out what we're at here. Because, and I was talking to Tim
All right,
about
ready?
this
I think,
yesterday.
ready when you guys are.
Is we have what we spent, what we,
All right, now we're on camera, and we're gonna be munching away.
Give me a chance to vote on it. I don't want you taking it.
but I think the what's missing.
We've established.
What's missing from here is we have what's spent. We have what's encumbered. But we're missing the part that we're expecting to spend, but we haven't ordered yet.
Greg, we are on what?
So
We have
there's
one
a
sheet
whole,
left
so
for
you
budget
can't
facts?
say that this plus this equals our expenses, because there's stuff we're gonna do that we haven't ordered yet that doesn't even show up.
No, I don't.
And it's got overtime tonight, so
There's a few.
Oh, yeah. I don't know, I don't remember who said it. See that police officer come out, deny. I was there, I saw it. Karen just stepped out.
Okay, so wait.
I'm not here yet.
No, let's, we're back in order. Let's go.
Oh,
I'm dying to use
I
that
don't know
thing.
who did.
Okay, to keep us on schedule, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. We have Tom Zuber, who introduced earlier, and he's going to share some information with you. I think it'll help you understand appropriated fund balance. What is it? Where does it come from? Why do districts have it? And we've got some slides, just two slides to share with you. So I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thank you.
Tom, if you just touch this once, it changes. Right, Joe?
Yeah, that's correct. So what I want to do, and I'll just briefly talk about appropriated fund balance. And as I was just kind of thinking about the discussion, because it is a pretty complicated topic when you really start thinking about appropriated fund balance and what does it really mean, and how does it impact my budget, okay? And really, when we talk about appropriated fund balance, we look at not only the appropriated fund balance that you use from your surplus funds, we'll call them, but also what you're pulling out of your reserve accounts, okay? So there's when we talk about appropriated fund balance, we're talking about what Greg was talking about from the reserves as well as from fund balance, okay? So what I thought we would do is really kind of talk about the perfect world first, because right now you're working on your budget, you have the budget workshop going on, and you're really trying to develop the budget. So what I thought I'd do is start with the 12-13 budget that was in your budget newsletter. Okay, so I took the numbers right out of the budget newsletter, and we'll just assume this is the perfect world. And your voter-approved budget was $42.1 million, okay? You had revenues identified in your budget brochure totaling $39 million, okay? And then you had identified appropriated fund balance and appropriated reserves, okay, to help support this operating budget. So you've got estimated expenditures of $42.1 million, all right? And you've got revenues that you can identify of $39.7 million. You have a gap in your budget. So where does that money come from to fill that gap? That comes from your savings accounts, your reserve funds, available fund balance, okay? So what you projected to pull from your savings account is $2.4 million. Now this was in 2012-13, okay? So we talk about that perfect world. Well, when you're developing a budget, you want to project, what do you think you're going to spend? And what do you think you're going to get in revenues? Okay? So, in that perfect world, we really did spend what we had in our budget. Okay, so we spent everything in our budget. $42,155,000. All right? Our revenues, the state passed an on-time budget. Our revenues came in exactly what we projected. Everybody paid their taxes. There were no contestants. State and federal aid came in. We collected $39.7 million. Okay? So what happens? Well, we've got a budget shortfall, right? Our real revenues were lower than our real expenses. And we said we were going to fill that gap with our savings accounts, okay? So we started the year, and there's one typo here that should be July 1st, 2012, okay? So we started the year with $19,573,000, all right? And if we spent all of our expenditures and received the revenues we thought we were going to take in, we had to use $2.4 million from our savings accounts. So our fund balance went from $19.5 million down to $17.1 million. All right. So in that perfect world where we are just right on top of the budget, we know exactly what we're going to spend, this is what would have happened. So this is what you projected to happen during 12-13. Okay? So now that we understand what kind of the perfect world looks like, what actually happened in the district? Okay, and again, these are right from the audit report. So what actually happened in the district in 12-13? All right? So again, your budget is the same. This is, again, right out of your newsletter. Voter approved budget, $42 million. Estimated revenues, $39.7 million. And you were planning on using $2.4 million in your savings. Okay? A balanced budget, 42.1, 42.1. All right? That's what every district starts out with, balanced budget. So then what happened? During the year, you had actual expenditures of little over $40.6 million. All right? So you thought you were going to spend $42 million. You only spent $40.6 million. So you had budget savings of $1.5 million. So you thought you were going to have to spend $42.1 million, and you only spent $40.6. Okay? So you had a savings. You didn't spend all that you thought you were going to spend. On the revenue side, your property taxes, including pilots, all right? You thought you were going to collect 25.2, you actually collected 25.3, okay? So you collected about $50,000 more than you thought you would. Primarily, that's pilots and late fees and so forth, okay? 43,000, you collected more than you thought you would. Your state aid, you thought it was going to be 2.5. There were some modifications to that. You collected $13 million, all right? Your other revenues, you projected for $1.4 million, you collected $1.8. So you collected almost $700,000 more than you thought you were going to collect. Okay? So what does that do to what you need to use from your savings account? In that perfect world, we were going to use $2.4 million. But because I didn't spend all of that all of my $42 million, that means I don't have to pull as much out of my savings account. Okay? And you can see if you add up the two variances and you subtract them from the 2.4 million, you end up with a loss for the year of $214,000. So you only had to pull out of your savings account $214,000. And you can see your fund balance went from 19.573 down to 19.359. So you eroded some fund balance. You used some of your savings account. Okay? It's interesting. I think the trend right now is most school districts are beginning to use or project using more and more of their savings accounts. Okay? And this is where we come in and say, you know, it's good for you to look at that and utilize these savings accounts, but you have to monitor it. Because if you were to use this whole $2.4 million in 1 year, what would happen to your fund balance? How many years can you survive at that level of eroding fund balance? Okay, and I think this year this number's up to 3.8 million potentially between the reserves and appropriated fund balance. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind as you're analyzing your budgets and putting your budgets together. Okay, so when it comes to appropriated fund balance, what does it do in your budget? That's your savings account. That's what you're using to fill the gap between your revenues and expenditures. And if you happen to not spend as much in a given year, or you happen to get more than you thought you would, it reduces what you have to pull out of your savings account, or what you have to pull out of your reserves. Okay?
I am so glad I didn't get all of that from, because I have to admit I read ahead, but you explaining that, it actually made a slightly different point that I think may not be as important to you, but might be important to this board, is that we've had people say, okay, if you're underspending what your proposed budget is, there's at least the impression that we are overtaxing our taxpayers. But the message I took away from this is, even conservatively, if I do the math, we were off by about half of 1%, that $214,000 versus the 40.6. And we didn't overtax anybody because we had to take that 214 out of our reserves that we already had. So the tax levy that was in that school year just barely didn't cover our expenses.
Correct.
And I think that's an important message, because people look at the 42 versus the 40 and they see that $2 million or $1.5 million difference, and they say, you took my money for taxes. But because it was funded this way, we didn't. We covered that risk factor with the reserves and ended up slightly under taxing.
Yeah, you didn't break even.
Right.
Okay, in true budget sense, you want to break even. Okay, but in this scenario, you didn't break even, and you're beginning to erode your fund balances. Okay, you know, we look at this budget variance right here. You had a budget of $42 million. You've got $40.6 million you actually spent. This is only about 3.6% of your budget. So you only ended up not spending 3.6% of your budget. You had about a little over 3.5% budget variance, we call it. Okay, so you know, if you reduce it down to your own personal account, you know, if you got $100, you know, you only ended the year with $3. So that's, you know, kind of an important concept. And even though it seems like a big number, it is only 3%, or 3.5%. Okay, so something to keep in mind. You did get some extra on the revenue side, so your total surplus is a little bit higher. Okay, but again, you did erode fund balance. Now your plan was to reduce fund balance by $2.4 million if you had spent your whole budget. But we don't want to spend the whole budget.
With all due respect to Greg or to all of those that go do this work into the budget, the bottom line is, at least for speaking for me, I don't want to spend any of that 2.4.
Yeah.
I don't want to spend it. I want it for a rainy day. We just weathered a rainy decade, right? I don't want to spend any of it. I love that number of 200K. And we're actually under, like Karen said, we actually undertaxed everybody. Are we sitting on a golden egg? No, because we've dwindled it away a little, but the bottom line is that 200K is a beautiful number. That's pretty stinking close to where we should be, and we're able to weather another storm. God forbid we have one.
And I'd also like to say something else on that. I think there's also the perception by some of the taxpayers that, you know, if you have a $42 million budget, that there's some great effort going on everybody's behalf to hurry up and spend $42 million. And I think what this underspend, part of what it shows, some of it is maybe some things didn't happen that we thought were going to happen, but I also think it's that people are making careful choices about what they should and shouldn't be spending, and they're trying to do the right thing, and by doing that, they're actually managing the cost down. And I think sometimes we don't give the people working in our schools enough credit for actually, not trying to, oh, this is how much I have to spend, but really saying, okay, how can I do this as cost effectively as possible? And I think these numbers show that people are doing that.
I think the one thing you have to be careful about, and the trend is, this number is getting larger. Okay?
Yeah,
One is
that's-
because of the perception of
long-term
reserves, and the fact that in order to maintain programs, districts are using and appropriating more reserves. Okay? They are doing that as part of their budget process. And as those numbers increase, okay, that creates the potential for that number to increase. Okay? As I said, you initially thought you were going to reduce your savings accounts by 2.4 million. All right? You only reduced it by 200,000. Now this is 12-13. Okay? So these are all the real numbers from the 2012-2013 audit. So obviously you've got 13-14 that you're going through now. Okay? So we'll see the results of those in August. Okay? And you're developing your budget now. So that's just the key concepts with the appropriated reserves. It's something in the board trainings that we do that we try and focus on, and understanding that this is your savings. You're using 2.4 million of your savings. However, as a result of what you didn't spend or what you received in excess, you only had to spend 200,000 of your savings.
So I understand it's just mid-March and we have a couple more months to go. But I know, I was just talking with somebody during the break about, we know what we've spent, we know what's encumbered, but we don't necessarily have a clear picture of the stuff that we're expecting to spend but hasn't been encumbered yet. And by that, I know some of the things are encumbered up front that have to do with teacher salaries and stuff, but there are other things, if we haven't ordered it, it's not going to show up yet. Do we have any way of seeing if we're on a trajectory to be, where versus where like this one, we were about $2 million lower in spending than we had planned. Do we have a trajectory that says where we're going to be against what we expected to spend this year?
Well, the fund balance projection that we shared at the last board meeting, we've shared a couple of those, that actually doesn't look at the appropriations report that we first shared with the board. What that looks at is, what have we spent to date, how is it trending, and we trended forward. So that doesn't break it down in, she doesn't even list what's encumbered on there. She works off of, this is what we've spent, these are the things we know we're going to spend going forward, the big ticket items, and then she trends forward our spending patterns for the first 8 or 9 months and carries that to the end of the year.
But when we trend it forward, do we take out any large one-time purchases so that's not counted into the trend?
Yeah, typically we don't have a lot of, unless our computer network, unless we have a situation like that, shouldn't have any really large one-time things that aren't already accounted for as a separate line item in her fund balance. And
so I can't remember, can you remind me how close to the, what we projected at the beginning, when we did the budget last year, where we think we're going to be when it gets to the end of the year?
Yes. So if our budget went exactly as we planned, we would end up the year talking about his perfect world with 1.2 million left.
Okay.
Because we planned on having that in there.
Right.
And when we plan on having that in there, it's built in there in certain places. So I know some of the discussions I've had with Jerry about some of the trends and stuff. Some of his questions very valid. It looks like a large increase. Well, part of it is compounding, but part of it is we had $100,000 of fund balance built into that number. If I don't put it there, it's got to be somewhere. And I can tell you in this next budget cycle, I've knocked down the money I plan in there by about $300,000, taking a much more aggressive approach.
Greg, would it be helpful if we went back to prior to Mr. Havens, when there is a drop dead date for spending? I mean, I know we have it in the district I work for. I don't know if it's March 1st, April 1st, but that's it. You've spent what you can, unless you got a printer that dies and we have to buy a new one, but there's no foo-foo spending. You know, not that there's foo-foo, but
Right.
you can't just go and buy willy-nilly,
Yep.
okay? And that's it, because then you know exactly, give or take, I mean, you're not gonna, you can really whittle that right down so you know pretty much what you're gonna end up
But
with.
most of our spending has already been done, correct? I mean, we've bought all of our textbooks, we've bought all of our supplies. You know what the salaries are gonna be, you know what the fringe benefits are gonna be, you know how much gasoline we're gonna use or diesel fuel between now and the end of the year. I would think by now, we've probably spent probably 95 or 96% of our budget by now.
I would say that's correct.
So there's not much left, I mean,
Right. And
But we
Carla,
seem to always have a lot left encumbered. And I know that they like to, even though it's
that number
stuff that
just
we
plummeted.
needed, you know, but it's nice to see that the books are, you know, there's not that many outstanding POs come June 30th.
right.
That's a,
Right. So I'll give you an example of what I call managing fund balance. In the earlier submissions of the budget, we need a new transformer at OE. It's in Bob Moore's facilities improvement plan for $15,000. So that was in the original drafts that you saw before tonight. We have some equipment money available right now, so I've directed Bob, let's buy that now. Now, I reduced that out of next year's budget. When you get into June, if we're trending a little bit better than where we thought, and we're not counting on using that extra money like we are going next year,
right.
we always look at, are there things that are on next year's plate
that we
that we can spend
Yeah.
that just gives us relief for next year? A perfect example is, annually I would have a conversation with Mark Blankenberg and say, how are we with uniform replacement? And, you know, so there's certain areas, if we have that flexibility, Carla, we do that because it gives us flexibility moving forward. You know, so we do that if it's helpful, if we have the ability. We don't always have that ability, but, you know, we do look at it. I mean, that's why I said earlier, managing it, because, you know, it's all about, having the money is one thing, but how you manage it is a whole other thing.
So Greg, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I get the answer to the question I asked you before, because I think I figured it out. So if we trend everything and say, this is how much we're out looking to spend by the end of the year, and I agree with you, since the 1.2 million was sort of part of the budget, I don't consider that to be over.
Right.
You're the $1,067,000 is what you're
That's
on?
That's correct.
Okay,
That is correct.
so that's
the amount
roughly
we didn't plan on that
2%.
appears to be left over.
And I want to touch on something that Carla asked, because I would agree, and I see where you're going with it, that it's cleaner and it's prettier. But I don't necessarily think that we want to take away the ability of that flexibility at the end of the year. I don't think that's a good idea. Is it cleaner and prettier? Absolutely. Does it give all of us a great picture of what the final numbers will be in the end? Yeah. But at what cost? I mean, at losing flexibility. I agree with you, it looks better. I don't think it's a good idea.
I don't think, Phil, it changes what people spend. I think it changes the timing of it. If it's working the right way, when we used it, we said, listen, if you're going to do a biology lab in May and you need frogs, buy them now. Buy them now.
Right.
Set the money aside now, encumber it now, so that we get a true snapshot of where we're going to be, even though we might still have 2 months left in the year. You know, and like I said, transportation, maintenance, if something broke, we let those go through. And if there was an instructional thing that came up that nobody could have planned on, I mean, the superintendent and I actually sat down and we would review them. I would review them first. I'd go in and recommend, I think these are all legitimate, I think we should let these go through after a spending freeze. Most of them he said yes, there was a couple he said, no, we're not gonna do that. It doesn't really change what you spend, it just changes when you spend it, and it allows you to plan a little bit better. That's typically the goal of what Carlos explained.
But do you spend it now? Do you, like, let's say, May 15th, okay? And you know you're gonna have $800,000, okay? Do you buy it then, so that by the time you order it, it comes in, the PO's closed out, and you're done by July 1st? Or are you waiting till June 30th to order it and encumbering it for the following year?
June 1st.
No, it would be the first piece. Now, with my example of biology, if it was January and the freeze was at the end of January, we'd say encumber it, you can't because the thing's only lived so long. But we would say order it now, encumber it. It might not be delivered till May, but when we look at our snapshot of our financial position, we already know that money's committed.
Usually when you freeze spending, it only helps you the first year.
Right.
I mean, your administrators are smart enough, it's not gonna help you the second year.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
and
what-
also, I think
that's-
what you find is, people that are gonna submit, I'll call them frivolous things for purchase, are gonna do it whether there's a freezing spend or not.
Right. And
People who are rule followers
Yes.
will say there's a freeze, I can't submit for this even though I forgot it, regardless of whether it's best for the kids or not, because they're rule followers. And so the kids end up being on the short end of the stick. If you just do the normal process, everything gets evaluated for whether it's correct or not, and you don't have people self-selecting out of the process.
Can we, I'm not sure who answers this question, but based on our trends for what we've been taking out of our savings accounts, how long can we continue to do this? Because that's my concern in terms of, say there's another huge hurricane down in Long Island and, state's got to give them a whole pot of money, and suddenly, what we think is increasing in our state aid is not suddenly levels off or drops or whatever. How long can we continue to do that? Because if we can, for a long period of time, then we are talking about program staff and things like that, correct? So how long do you, based on what we have now, based on what we've been spending, how long can we do that?
I would say that we, in my opinion, we could continue to do that for about 4 or 5 years, but as I said earlier, the goal would be to, as the years go out, be less and less reliant on that amount.
Okay.
It starts at 1.8, get to 1.5, get to 1.1, and get it down to a manageable number at the end, because otherwise you're gonna do this. Boom.
Right, that
And
cliff.
then you're gonna have $1.8 million hole, which I guarantee you, the tax cap's not gonna touch that, state aid won't touch that, you're talking about program reduction.
Yep.
So we have these charts up here that show 204, I'll call it 215K gap that 1 year. How does that compare to previous years? Because you're saying $1.8 million gap, I'm seeing 215K gap. So what is that trend like over the years?
Well, just real quick, the gap, this is a gap, this isn't necessarily a budget gap. This is what you really lost during the year.
Right.
You really eroded fund balance $2.4 million. When you're talking about budget gaps, that's what you're talking about here. When you're developing your budget, and you need to fill that hole, you have less revenues than you're projecting expenditures. That's that gap. And this gap right now in most school districts, as a result of the economy, we're seeing the trend of this number increase. And I think it was 3.8 in this current projected amount for this district. If you were to have eroded $2.4 million instead of $200,000, you only got, what, maybe 8 years left?
Yeah, so I get that, but to me the $215,000 says how, if you track that over time, you're saying how good have I been at projecting both revenues and expenditures, right? And so how good have I been at estimating that, in this case, $2.5 million gap versus what I really ended up having as a gap? Because to me, that's a big And I'm gonna assume there was also some expected overage in there that we used to carry over to offset taxes for the next year. But, so I'm talking about the truly unexpected part of that. What's our track record been on that?
I would have to analyze that, but that fund balance sheet that I gave you with the 5 or 6 years, take that bottom line number and 22 million and 19 million, and that's gonna show you where we ended up. But Karen, within that, the 1 year when we went down about 3 million, there was a large decrease in the capital reserve, so you kind of want to look at what made up that number, but that's going to give you a sense of where we ended up. It's not going to tell you where we ended up versus what we planned. I mean, we could analyze that and give you that. That's one of the ways that it's shown on the executive summary for the audit committee when
But for me, the real important piece of data is how much money have we really had to pull out of our savings account to compensate for what we spent over our revenues? Because, you know, it's not just estimating your costs, you also have to estimate the revenue side, right? So it could have been because revenues were lower and costs were actually lower, but not by as much as revenues. You know, there's lots of reasons. And so then that tells me, okay, maybe I'm looking at a trend of 200K to 500K versus 1.8 million.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you, and that was kind of the side discussion we were having here, is that is the number that matters.
Yeah.
The special ed,
one of the numbers.
Special ed going forward, we have no control over. Your best sense, Joe, how much more is Common Core going to cost us in terms of extra help in the years going forward? Or are we going to be staffed now that pressure will be off? And maybe that's an unfair question.
It's a tough one.
I mean, a lot of our costs are additional staff for next year.
We can choose to support it or not, you know what I mean? We can choose to add that support in for
Yeah,
our
but you
students
can't,
and staff.
you can't
Some districts
choose,
aren't choosing that.
you
Some
can't choose
districts are
though for some
cutting.
kids, can you? I mean, some kids it's mandated, right?
So I think that one of the ways, so we can be very creative in how we provide academic intervention support. So I'll give you Ontario Elementary. Sometimes we tend to think of academic intervention support as additional staff.
Right.
And sometimes it is. And sometimes that is the best option. Sometimes support in the context of the general ed classroom is best. So the teacher making time for her or him to work with those kids additional, because they work with them primary and they see where they're struggling and they see what they need. At OE, we've been able to build in a half an hour of an academic intervention period and teachers work with kids. Could that be done more efficiently or effectively with more staff down the road? Could we creatively look at that and then realize a cost to that? Absolutely. Freewell's doing a similar thing with an academic intervention block. So I think some of it is providing the support so that teachers can provide the additional support to kids. I think that I think one of the costs, when you mentioned special education, you think of our most at-risk kids, our kids who struggle most to meet the current standards, and now we've kind of raised them. And so perhaps those kids in support need more one-on-one attention. I do see some of our personnel costs going up, but I think that adding the special ed teachers that we've added, I think that's going to help us. And I think that's going to be a solution that's going to help us in the next couple of years. Adding some of the support teachers, like the reading teacher and the teaching assistant and the half of a reading teacher, I think that's going to help give teachers some relief. I don't think, in other words, I don't think after this year we're going to have to double what we've added this year next year. But we may need to add some staff to help us support that.
Do we buy the modules?
They're free, but we use the modules. So, and what costs us with the modules is the copying, and we buy that through BOCES. It's all aidable. Next summer we're going to be modifying the modules, pacing the doing some things with the modules, and we'll hopefully be able to do that within our curriculum management system, which is called Atlas currently. So.
But we're not writing our own curriculum to meet the standards, we're using the modules to meet the standards.
The bulk of our money has been spent to give teachers time to plan with the modules. This summer, we're going to give the teachers an opportunity to pace out those modules, to really think critically about how they're managing their time within the modules and whether or not they need to build some other things in addition to the modules, like a guided reading piece or how that would fit. So we do feel like we need to do some work with those, curriculum work with those modules to make them better meet our needs, but we have chosen to adapt the modules.
But even if we adopt, the teachers still have to do lesson plans, and I mean, things that everybody's a year one teacher again, right? Because they don't have prior lesson plans to fall back on anymore.
One of the things built into this budget, and Renee was a big proponent of making sure that we have more time for our staff. And more time obviously equals more dollars. In past years when we have been cutting back, the curriculum budget for the staff has also been cut back probably disproportionately than some of the other budgets. So that's back up to a level where we think we can provide teachers with the time and support to make those adjustments to the modules to better meet our kids' needs.
That was one of the line items that you covered, I specifically remember, and it almost seems like I remember $90K that you had asked for. Was it 100?
That's your,
Yeah.
that's your R&D budget though, that
Yeah,
should
so
be.
that's-
Right, we pumped it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
It used to be higher years ago.
Okay.
We cut it back down, but now with the Common Core, Joe identified a need, and I think we increased it by 50, Joe?
Yeah, about
And so, you know, it was at 50, I think we're up at 90 now or something like that.
I think it's,
All right, so,
you know, we talked about the special ed programs and that, but I'd like to see a little bit more with enrichment because we have IB programs and that. We need some feeder programs that you can't have a varsity JV soccer team without having a rec league down below feeding it. And I think there's a lot of kids missing out that are at the higher level so I might even switch to the other option if we could put a little bit of enrichment more in our schools. But
We can have any program we want.
I know.
People are willing to support it.
right.
I
And
would actually disagree because our IB program's been growing every year, and if it's not being fed, how could it be growing every year?
in the future, because there used to be more enrichment, I don't think there's as much anymore. Because there used to be one teacher at each building, now there's not, there's one person in the district. The other question I have tying back to this is it correlate with the fund balances, okay, the assigned encumbrances? So we were off, say, 200,000 in that one year. If we spent 200,000 less on that, would we have lost zero? Is that an accurate statement or no?
Yeah.
Say it again?
If this number was $200,000 lower?
No, you show the difference is $200,000 on the other slide or whatever.
It's on that one.
Okay, it's on there, I can't, I don't have my glasses on. But, so like our fund balances, we have an assigned encumbrances, like 2012 was 1,121,000, or 2013, whatever that would go. If we, that doesn't correlate.
No, because encumbrances are not an expenditure, they're a promise or an obligation to spend, not, you haven't spent it yet. So you don't, it doesn't show up.
Not in that budget year then.
Right, it doesn't show up in that budget year. It shows up in the budget year you actually expend the funds. Whereas an accrual, different, an accrual shows up, like I said, for ERS, we won't pay that bill until March, but we will accrue 3 months worth of ERS expense. It'll show up in our expenditure column at the end of 13-14. It'll be the bill plus 3 months of an accrual. So, two different concepts, but.
Yep.
Tom, did you have follow-up on that point?
Well, I was just saying, this is the actual expenditures. There are no encumbrances in this number here. So this is the expense that took place during the year. This is the revenue that was recorded in a year. Okay, encumbrances are a separate item.
Okay.
Does the board have any other questions on the report that Tom presented?
Thank you for staying so late.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tom.
Now we'll talk next steps.
All right, we're getting there.
I feel like next steps were discussed early on, but basically, we'll be looking to the board to make a decision about the budget at the next board meeting on April 10th, whether we choose option 1 or 2 or some other thing. In between where we are now and April 10th, if the governor's budget changes or if we see something different, we will certainly work that in and make sure that we keep the board apprised as as outside influences affect what we decide to do with our budget for 2014-15. Assuming approval on April 10th of the budget, we'll put our budget presentation together for the community, and we'll begin making our rounds throughout the community to the various groups to inform them of our budget, to field any questions they may have, and to make sure that they have the information they need so that on May 20th, when the budget vote occurs, they can make an informed decision. On May 8th, we also have our public budget presentation so that anybody in the public can come and hear the presentation who would like to. We get a lot in our individual community forums that we go to though as well.
And also usually about 2 board members go to each one of those presentations.
Typically, we have board members presenting with us, yeah, as we go around.
You would like to, I assume you would like to have as many as can make it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
What happens is we post that on our website, and then it also gets posted in the board portal, and then you sign up so you know who's going to be where, when. You kind of spread yourselves out, or
Yeah, 'cause there's a
we've
lot
seen
of them.
board members in the past that attend every single one because their schedule allows it, but that really is up to your own personal
There's usually about a
schedule.
dozen of them, isn't there?
Yeah.
About 14.
We also sometimes have board members present with us,
Mhm.
a slide or two, or whatever you're comfortable with. It's not that's what has been done before, but it's whatever you're comfortable with.
And just to piggyback on what Tim said, because that is really, we have cut a lot of our enrichment out, and it's one of the things that kind of fell by the wayside. And he's, I really believe that he is 100% right with, we have so many of the kids who fell off, but then we do have a lot of kids who did meet or surpass the benchmarks. And that is true. If they don't continue to get the enrichment, then they are not going to be, smart kids are always going to be smart kids. They don't dumb down, but they don't also get higher without that enrichment. Is there any way with the way that the scheduling goes and, in elementary and middle school, that if some kids are getting RTI or AIS, whatever you want to call it, that other kids, can get enrichment? We don't really have an enrichment teacher in the buildings anymore, do we?
We have an enrichment coordinator, Susan Mack. One of the things, so a couple of things about enrichment. Would I love more staff to help do enrichment? I absolutely would. When I think about enrichment, though, I need to make sure that I'm clear with what my philosophy is, and that is some of those kids on that list who need enrichment, they're in blue and they're in green, but they're also in yellow and red. So some of what we do with enrichment, and Susan Mack, does a nice job with this. It's before school programs, after school programs, it's specific areas of interest. As a matter of fact, I sat with Sue Mack yesterday, and we were talking about a couple of high school kids who are really getting into weather and weather predictions, and they've been exploring some things. What are the chances that we can get a weather balloon and study some patterns in weather and those kinds of things? Mrs. Morgan is out on maternity leave, but she's one of our earth science teachers who's very dynamic and probably spurred this interest. But so the other piece is sometimes when you have a person providing enrichment, then the larger staff thinks that when kids need more, they go to the enrichment. So some of our philosophy on enrichment is it should be every kid every day should get some enrichment in their classroom. That is not to say, though, that what's being described in terms of providing more program with additional staff isn't something that I wouldn't want to explore. But just, there's lots of, it's a complicated issue in terms of how you provide that and to whom.
And to put a dollar amount on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah. I think, there's non-standard things. I remember when Mr. Pullen was at the elementary school. He used to have the kids, if they could come and propose a topic to him that they thought was really important, they could actually speak in an assembly about it. I mean, that doesn't fall under enrichment, but that idea of public speaking, doing your research on a topic, and then presenting it to your entire school, to me, that's enrichment.
I think the kids but there's kids in there that aren't challenged by what they're learning that day, and they're basically can do it already or can get it done in that time frame that it's
I mean,
not challenging them enough.
I know in
And
the
they
middle
need to
school, we
get
have,
challenged.
honors and, accelerated and things like that. I know in another district, if we have a kid, let's say in 5th grade, who is just a math genius, he or she actually attends middle school math before coming to elementary school. It doesn't cost anything, because the buses run anyway. That child just goes and does 6th grade math. And that's a way of enriching that child's
I know
math.
that that's happened, actually. There's
I just
somebody,
wondered if we offered that, or, I mean, sometimes you really get a kid that 5th grade math, you're like,
I know
Yeah.
there's kids in my daughter's grade that have done that. They were a whole 2 years ahead, and they were taking it with them. So I know that that exists.
so
especially
that's
in
an
middle
option for some kids. How about,
That happens for,
I know it's a minuscule amount.
so we have, I'm thinking in terms of the middle school, I know we have a 6th grader who is taking 7th grade courses. We have a couple of 7th graders, and we have at least one 8th grader who's taking some high school level courses beyond the algebra.
Okay, but what about somebody in 5th grade going to middle school? Do we do that at all? Have we ever
2
looked at
different
that?
runs,
We haven't looked at that.
because they have a second run.
I think it's a discussion we probably,
Yeah,
if we want to
yeah.
include it in the budget for next year, and it's something that
Go with that.
that the board really
It's
wants
not-
to
It's not
push.
really a cost.
Well, it's not, well, that's what I was kind of chomping at the bit to say here, is it's a great conversation, but it's a great conversation to have offline and not during the budget presentation, and let's refocus on the budget here, and we're 35 minutes. It's a good conversation. I don't want to stifle a good conversation, but we're doing a budget review, we're 35 minutes over, and it's not a budget discussion. I don't even care if we add it to an agenda.
Well, I just was asking if we offer things like that with regard to enrichment, if we
Maybe-
can go with option 1 or option 2.
Maybe after the budget process is passed, it would be a good idea to have Susan Mack come in and talk about the various ways that we are enriching our
Agenda
program.
item.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
we could set it as a goal for next year when we do the school goals.
Yeah.
But you,
No, you just talked about all the presentations that are gonna go on, and that's good. In our policy, we talk about the process of budget planning and development should allow for community input and contains numerous opportunities for public information and feedback. We don't really do that, so in the future, maybe next year, we can look at a way that we can evolve, because people can go hear a presentation when it's already a done deal, and, and they may have some ideas.
But that's why you represent the community, so that throughout the budget process, before we adopt on April 10th, you are taking community input. If you want a more structured format, that's something we can explore. But the way that we feel like we're meeting that policy is that you, as board members, are collecting feedback, are answering questions, are collecting that information and presenting it.
I think it's also, if that's the route we want to take, that's on the board to do. That's not on
yeah,
the
I think
district.
that's what,
Right.
I think that's,
Right.
I think that's
So
your-
it's
your
something that we would have to design, the board would have to approve, this is how we're going to do it, we're going to do
Round
different.
Right,
tables.
because I looked at a couple other schools around here, I know Canada does it, it's right on their thing, that they have a budget workshop that allows conversations.
It's not necessarily a bad
Right.
idea, it just the board has to make that
Correct.
happen, not the district.
And it
Correct,
also
yeah.
starts
That-
like February.
No, they're actually doing it this month.
Right.
Oh, no,
They're doing it-
yeah.
A couple other schools are doing it this month at their things. They got like 3 budget workshops and allowing community input. That's all.
I think it's got to start earlier than that, I
I would
would
think
start
so,
it in the fall, or,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah,
because that's when they start.
just something,
going.
just throwing it out there.
Okay.
All right, any more questions for the admin? Okay, good. So agenda item 5 is done. I think that being said, thanks, Greg and
Close the meeting.
Paul. We're not going to close the meeting. I'm actually going to ask for a motion to go into anticipated executive session to review a specific personnel matter. Karen, thank you. Can I get a Tim, second? Thank you. Is there any discussion on our executive session? No? All right.
Do we know how to make sure that camera's not?
We're going to do it right now.
Yeah. All in favor? That was a good question. Is there any opposed?
Joe, can you run a
We'll be out of
McDonald's for me, Joe?
Take care of yourself.
Can you run a McDonald's for me?
I'll eat it for you,
If you
too.
could throw me under the